Like we're here in London, and these are your top stories. Ukraine says Wagner mercenaries remain in the country after leader Yevgeny Prigozhin agrees to exile following an aborted mutiny against Vladimir Putin. There are a few signs of market turmoil amid contained moves in oil, wheat, stocks and currencies after the weekend events in Russia. Plus, China says it supports Russia's actions to maintain national stability as the nation's diplomats meet. So let's take a look at the futures. I have to say a lot of traders this morning are trying to figure out rather unsuccessfully how to trade what we saw over the weekend. An incredible 24 hours of geopolitics that was really unfolding live over the weekend, with then the retreat of the Wagner chief. Unclear what deal they brokered and what that means going forward. For the moment, there is a sense of calm in the markets. How long this stays for is unclear, as long as we don't know actually what kind of deal that they brokered and what that means for the vulnerability of Vladimir Putin, or what that means for the strength of Ukraine going forward. Unclear what we saw over the weekend and whether that means that the war from now on will change somewhat. So we look at commodities. First of all, this is probably the one thing that would be impacted the most. Crude, because Russia is a huge exporter of crude. I'm looking at Brent crude. I could look at WTI, but for the moment, holding up at 74.49. I know a lot of the focus is also on wheat, so we'll have a full roundup of some of the soft agriculture and some of the soft commodities. Interesting to see equity indices actually holding up. But Germany gaining some 0.2% at the open. The France CAC 40 also gaining 0.2%. There is also, to put all of this into context, what's been going on in the U.S. with the NASDAQ gaining quite significantly. We're at the six-month point in the year, so they've been gaining quite significantly, those U.S. indices. They've been getting quite significantly up until now, but now Wall Street, again, having second doubts about what the inflation picture looks like for the Fed and what that means for interest rate hikes. So let's try and actually break it down because of the pretty incredible 24 hours that we saw in the weekend. And so we've identified a couple of industries that could move on the back of course, any change in relations between Russia and Ukraine and whether Vladimir Putin can stay on as is in power. First of all, we look at the defense stocks. So for the moment, down some 0.5% for Dassault BAE System, down 0.6%. Again, one of the other things that we're watching out for is not only defense stocks, but what we're seeing, for example, in agriculture, and also some of the things that we're seeing in commodities at large. Now, the market reaction to this weekend's events in Russia, as we've been saying, relatively calm. So here with more is our Bloomberg Markets reporter, Valerie Teitel. Valerie, good morning. I guess the problem is that traders just don't know what to do with this.
It's always hard for markets, Francine, to price in these geopolitical events, but you'd think there might be some jitters, maybe a slight risk-off tone this morning, but we're just not seeing it. A lot of eyes on the FX Open late last night in Asia, eyes on the euro dollar and how that was trading, but as you can see, it's very flat. Even in the Open, in the Asia session, it traded roughly unchanged from Friday's close. For markets, your eye goes next to what's going on in commodities. I want to check in on oil and gold. Oil is interesting. It's up 1% this morning, but you can read that it was almost a unwind of last week's price action. Oil dropped 4% last week, so you can read into that maybe it's just having a bit of retracement of that fall. And then gold is the next one I want to check in on. Again, little change. Now, if we go back to events around September 11, for example, gold rose nearly 8%, but it's not having that kind of risk-off bid this morning. morning. And lastly, just on the general risk sentiment tone, those S&P futures are trading with a bit of positivity, up just 0.1%. And there isn't necessarily a risk-off bid into treasuries. They are rallying 1% this morning, but it's hard to really call that a risk-off move, Francine.
Yeah, so Valerie, where should we be watching out for potential volatility? As again, we start trading, it's going to be a long week. We have a lot of central bankers, with also Jay Powell showing up in Portugal, Sintra, for the ECB conference.
Look, as the European markets start trading, a lot of people are asking, do we need to have an eye on these Russian assets? But remember, a lot of these Russian assets are under quite large sanctions. They're not necessarily freely traded and can't be traded by foreigners. So I would just keep an eye on the usual risk barometers, looking at those equity futures in the U.S. And then if we do get any headlines, my eye is going to go to the euro. Any negativity on this situation developing in Russia would be negative for the euro. That would be my first risk barometer I'd have my eye on any headlines.
Valerie, thanks so much. Valerie Teitel there with some of the markets we're watching. Now, the impact of the Wagner mercenary group's mutiny in subsequent backing down is being assessed around the world. While leader Evgeny Prigozhin has agreed to go into exile, an advisor to Ukraine's president says there are no indications that the group is retreating from conflict areas. Now, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Maria Today, who's been covering, of course, this conflict from the very beginning. So, Maria, a pretty incredible, extraordinary weekend of unrest in Russia. What does this mean for Vladimir Putin?
Yes, Francine, especially that Friday to the Saturday really did seem this country was on the brink of serious unrest. And now today, Francine, we have in the morning, and this is pretty significant in terms of the optics coming out of the Kremlin, footage from Sergei Shoigu, that is the defense minister, the head of the MOD of Russia, allegedly on a helicopter inspecting the work of Russian troops. And this would show that he is still well employed at the job, leading this war effort, and he is crucial because a lot of the tensions that led to this insurrection by Prigozhin had to do with the frictions between Wagner and the Russian army. Now, when it comes to Vladimir Putin, we have not heard or seen from the Russian leader since the Saturday morning. That's when he put out a speech saying that Russia was witnessing, quote, treason. He almost compared it to 1917. That is a crucial date for Russian history. But so far, what we know is that there will be no charges of mutiny on Wagner. It has not been officially dismantled. And Prigozhin allegedly now still alive and on his way to Belarus.
Yeah, a lot of people say it's pretty incredible that they've come on and actually, agreed some kind of truce. We wonder what the deal behind that is. So how has the international community reacted, Maria?
Yes, and Francine, that is the crucial question, and it is the key question. Everyone that I spoke to yesterday said this deal by Lukashenko, he's not a mediator in good faith. He must have been promised something for this move, and what is it? The details are very murky. Now, when it comes to the international community, Francine, we know there was a phone call yesterday between President Biden and President Zelensky. We also heard from the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who said the reality is the episode shows there are serious cracks in the system for Vladimir Putin. Let's take a look.
This raises profound questions. It shows real cracks. We can't speculate or know exactly where that's going to go. We do know that Putin has a lot more to answer for in the weeks and months ahead.
And that is the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken yesterday on U.S. media. Now, when it comes to the European side of this, foreign ministers are meeting today in Luxembourg. The idea is they say that this is an internal issue for Russia. It does appear to be contained for the time being. It's not fatal maybe for Vladimir Putin. But again, this idea of Vladimir Putin as the KGB man, the all-powerful Russian leader, they say has been rattled by the episode on Saturday.
Yeah, so do we know, Maria, how this could change the war? Is it too soon? Does it give a clear advantage to Ukraine?
Yes, and that's a very good point, too. And a lot of this has changed from the Saturday to today because, of course, we did not see this boiling point on the streets of Moscow. At one point, it really seemed there could be serious unrest in the country and, again, a fight and a struggle for power. Now, one of the Ukrainian officials that I spoke to on the Saturday told me either ways, it is good news for Ukraine because, once again, it pushes back against the idea that Vladimir Putin is invincible and that Russia is somehow this mighty army. So for the Ukrainians, on this idea of the optics, it works. Whether it gives them a competitive advantage on the battlefield, it is probably too early to tell.
Thank you so much. Our Maria today there with the very latest, of course, from Brussels. We'll have plenty more on this pretty incredible 24 hours over the weekend. It's very clear when you speak to traders or also some of the trading houses that they're not sure what to do with the situation. So they're monitoring it very closely. We were earlier looking at energy, or not energy stocks, but defense stocks that are seeing a bit of pressure now. Energy stocks are actually gaining 0.7% for BP, but it's difficult to trade. We don't exactly know what the deal is between the rebel and Vladimir Putin. We don't exactly know what kind of advantage, if any, this gives to Ukraine. And then there's a whole story about U.S. intelligence, the fact that the U.S. were aware of something but didn't necessarily tell EU intelligence. Coming up, global commodity markets face fresh risks from the uprising in Russia. We'll tell you what you need to know. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
The deal was the brainchild of Apollo CEO Mark Rowan. In January, Apollo closed its $11 billion all-stock merger with Athene Holding. It had already owned 35% of the insurer. Here's what Apollo gets out of the deal. Assets under management. Apollo expects them to double to about $1 trillion by 2026. Much of that projected growth will come from the merger, and those assets are especially attractive to Apollo. Insurance companies typically go after much more modest returns than buyout investors. That will give Apollo more options for investing the cash. Athene is a steady provider of fee income. It has grown into one of the nation's biggest holders of fixed annuities, those retirement savings products favored by risk-averse customers. The merger will also allow Apollo to simplify its governance. It gave up its dual-class share structure and adopted a one-share, one-vote plan. The hope is that will eventually lead to Apollo's inclusion in the S&P 500.
Business Week Radio, live weekday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern.
We got a little bit of talking.
Come on, are you guys ready?
Harnessing the power of Bloomberg Business Week, Carol Masser and Tim Stanovic bring you the latest news from the worlds of business, technology, politics, and more.
How does the Fed play into this and what the Fed does potentially?
This is so exhausting and this is so all-encompassing.
Listen on Bloomberg Radio and streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 11 minutes into the European trading day. For the moment, there's quite a lot of calm after the pretty crazy weekend that we've lived through with the mutiny attempt in Russia and then the backing down of the Wagner chief. We're still trying to figure out what this means for Ukraine, Russia, what it means also for intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Europe. European stocks down 0.1%. So for the moment, there's calm, and I guess they're trying to wait their cues on what central banks and inflationary pressures there are to come. The picture over in China is, of course, important as well. We seem to have forgotten that it was only 4 or 5 days ago that Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, showed up in Beijing, one of the first time this happened in the last couple of years, to talk about them coming closer. Now, this is a daily briefing of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, so we'll monitor that very, very closely. China believes that Russia can maintain stability. For the moment, is the main line coming out of that press conference. Now, oil fluctuated over the weekend as investors weighed the potential for more civil unrest in Russia following the short-lived rebellion in the major OPEC Plus producer. Now, the failed uprising also has implications for the wheat market. Russia, expected to be the world's top wheat exporter this season and next, any disruption to its shipments will have an impact on global prices. Well, wheat futures swung between gains and losses over the weekend. Joining us now is Kona Haig, head of commodities research at ED&F Man. Kona, thank you for joining us. As always, the weekend was pretty incredible. We were following the live images very closely. If there was some more eruption in Russia, without going as far as civil war, but instability, what does that mean for wheat and other soft commodities that they produce?
Well, it would be pretty significant, but I guess the big question is if there were to be further unrest. And I think that is the issue right now. I think the market feels that perhaps it might not be full-blown. It's going to be a wait-and-see approach right now. For sure, as we all know from the last year and a half, Russia is the biggest wheat, biggest oil, biggest nat gas. You know, they're the biggest exporter in the world. And so absolutely vital for the world supplies in commodities. But what is interesting to see is that prices today are substantially lower than they were at the peak last year. You know, they're back to one-year lows or even more, whether it's wheat, whether it's grains, whether it's corn, nat gas even. So I think what we're trying to say is that things have normalized to a certain extent, despite this area still being in turmoil. Now, yes, for sure, if escalation were to increase, things could change. But for now, I think it's just a wait-and-see approach.
But so, Kona, first of all, what can you tell us about who is actually in charge of some of the wheat exports from Russia? And where are they going to? Are they mainly Asia, or is there still quite a lot being exported around the world, including Europe?
So it's going to North Africa, it's going to Asia. So it is actually finding its way around to a lot of the major destination countries. Europe also to a certain extent, some of it is going to, but Europe obviously is quite a big producer of wheat itself. So I think those flows should not be disrupted. At the moment, or in fact for a while, Russia has been threatening to pull out of the grains corridor, the one that's been brokered by Turkey and the United Nations. But the reality is they need that. And even every time he threatens to come out of the deal, within a few months, they're back in. So I think it just shows that they need this grain corridor as much as Ukraine does and the rest of the world. It's absolutely integral to their needs. And the market may stop calling Putin's bluff after a while and realize that actually, you know what, things are flowing. We don't need to worry too much. Right now, the focus for grains right now is all about weather in Europe, weather in America. It's all about dryness and soil moisture at this point in time. Nothing else seems to be too impactful right now, apart from the outlook for the next crops.
Yeah, Kona, I mean, when you look at some of, the flows, how far in advance are these negotiated? I don't know whether they're long-term contracts, for example, or how it works with some of the soft commodities, including wheat, and whether if there's a real question mark further down the line, if we were to question who is in charge of Russia, what happens to some of these longer-term contracts?
Yeah, I think that is definitely an issue. These contracts are done a long time in advance. They're long-standing supply agreements, negotiations, and partnerships have been in the making for a long time. Now, clearly, Putin is in charge now and has been for the last 22 years. If he were to be weakened, and clearly this situation has weakened his position somewhat, there's speculation as to how long he can continue, and worse still, if things were to lead to more unrest or uncertainty in terms of leadership at the top, questions will arise, who will do that? But as per the oil and grains, these are strategically such important commodities and sources of export revenue for Russia. No matter who is in charge, they're going to have to make sure that those sources and those supplies continue to come out, because it's absolutely integral for Russia's economy. So I don't think worst case scenario, you get a civil war. Whoever's at the top, those flows will have to continue because it's their lifeline.
Kona, at the same time, we've seen constant threats about some of the grains and corridors in the Black Sea, but actually that's never really, put in place, or it hasn't really been tested, right? Some of these threats haven't materialized. It's now going to, even if we don't see civil war, is that going to materialize further, or it's not, because this would hurt the West more than anyone internally?
I do believe it would hurt Russia, actually, if this grain corridor were to be stopped, because Russia is on the brink of harvesting a massive crop, and they're going to need to send that out quickly and instantly to all the destination countries. So they can't be sitting on massive reserves and have nowhere to export it just because they've decided to come out of a deal. So I think they will need to make sure that that comes out. So they may try and use some negotiation tactics, whoever's in charge, to try and get a few sanctions lifted, as they have been for a while. But the reality is they need those massive wheat exports to get out to all the importing regions, and that's just not an option at this point to not do that.
Again, the situation is very fluid. I mean, at the moment it's very calm, which also makes us wonder whether it'll stay like this or not. What's your take on oil prices? OPEC Plus, certainly Saudi Arabia, is doing quite a lot to stabilize the markets by cutting production. I mean, do they have to change if something happens with Russia production?
Yeah, so Saudi and Russia have had a very strong relationship throughout. They've been almost on friendly terms despite this last 18 months. What happens now is, clearly, if Putin's in control, things stay as it is. Saudi will be watching carefully to see what's happening. Clearly, Saudi has taken the burden in terms of any cutback in OPEC Plus. Russia hasn't actually diminished too much. It's only a little bit less that we're going to expect to see in June versus May, in line with the agreement that was made in April. I think what you're going to see is probably Russia will comply, and Saudi will just keep on watching. I think they're just going to have to do the heavy lifting in terms of cutback. Clearly, the world demand outlook is not improving, if you like. The high interest rate environment, low falling PMIs, China still sort of anemic in terms of their growth outlook. All of this is not helping energy demand, and I think supply is going to have to adjust lower to match that lower demand outlook. And if Russia's not going to do it, and Russia clearly needs that oil export revenue, then it's going to be back to Saudi.
Kona, thank you so much. Kona Haik there, Head of Commodities Research at ED&F Man. Now, coming up, we'll get your stocks on the move as well, including Lloyds Bank, which is being downgraded by JP Morgan. We'll have a full roundup of some of the UK stocks and, of course, worldwide. This is Bloomberg. What do you like most about your job?
I think the people. I mean, ultimately, we're a people business. A lot of what my job is as CEO of the company is to give those people sort of motivation, to tell them where we're going, to encourage them to come up and do their best work, to encourage them to collaborate. Sometimes you sort of think you're almost a psychologist, as you are a business leader, I think, sometimes.
And so what's your best piece of advice?
I love pitches. I love being sort of leading from the front, if you like, and spending times with teams. I love to see the work that we're doing. When we pitch for a piece of new business, often when we come together. So I guess I try and put myself in the seat of the client. And what's the client going to think when they see this work? Are they going to be excited? Is it going to turn their brand around? How's it going to resonate with their consumers? So as much as possible, I think probably I try and play that role.
source for news and analysis covering the biggest challenges facing the UK government, economy, financial services and markets.
Tax cuts should not be the priority. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
In this post-Brexit world, how do you see actually servicing your clients?
It was disruptive, and it's going to have implications to how capital raising works.
Now we're having the perfect storm in the UK.
Watch Francine Lacqua Thursdays at 9:30 a.m. only on Bloomberg, your global business authority. Markets count down in Europe from the financial centers of the world. Bloomberg Markets European Close with Guy Johnson in London and Alex Steele in New York. Real-time numbers, real-time analysis. Weekdays.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. 23 minutes into the European trading day. Calm, certainly after the 24 hours that we lived over the weekend with the mutiny in Russia and then the abandonment of the plan from the Wagner chief. But for the moment, European stocks, a little bit of pressure, but nothing huge, down 0.3%. Now, let's also take a look at some of the other top stories from today. In Greece, it's a landslide victory for Kyriakos Mitsotakis in the country's second vote in just over a month. The win gives the former prime minister a majority big enough to form a single-party government. Now, markets have previously rallied behind him as he made the economy central to his campaign. So we'll be keeping, of course, an eye on what happens when Greek markets open a little bit later on. Bloomberg has also learned that Goldman Sachs has started cutting managing directors across the globe as the firm reduces its headcount. Amid a deal slump, about 125 managing directors, including some of the investment bank, will lose their jobs as part of a deep cost savings drive at the bank, which has seen at least 3 rounds of job cuts in less than a year. And we also understand that JP Morgan is cutting about 40 investment bankers in North America. And finally, it's an iconic part of London's skyline, but in an era of hybrid working and rising costs, HSBC is reportedly planning to leave its Canary Wharf tower when the lease comes up in 2027. Now, the Times says the bank's employees will be told later today that they're downsizing to an office in St. Paul's, formerly the HQ of BT Group. Now, the move comes as HSBC looks to cut office space around the world by 40%. Let's also look at some of the stocks on the move with Joe Easton from our equities team. Hi, Joe. What do you have for us?
Morning, Fran. So Aston Martin is the best performing stock in the UK today, up around 9% at the open. They've got a couple of bits of news out today. Firstly, they're forming a strategic pact with Lucid over in the US. This is the maker of electric vehicles, and they will take a 3.7% stake in Aston Martin. Meanwhile, the UK company is also adjusting the terms of a deal with Mercedes. It will no longer give more shares to Mercedes. That deal will be done in cash, a bit more complicated, but both of those lifting the stock. That stock is actually trading at the highest level in a year, given the stake taken by Geely over in China has really changed the situation in terms of their balance sheet and boosted that one. We're also going to look at UK banks today because Lloyds is getting a downgrade at JP Morgan, just one of 3 sell ratings among 25 analysts covering that stock. That's hitting Lloyds today, down 1.4%. JP Morgan saying in a note that the probability of a hard landing in the UK economy is now higher due to the Bank of England rate cuts, and this could potentially hurt dividends. Interestingly, they also note that banks in the UK may have to pass on a lot of the rate hikes onto savers. That's hitting that stock. Finally, an interesting one over in France, SES Imagotag. This is a maker of digital tags for shopping products. That one gaining 7.6% after falling more than 60% on Friday during trading in Paris. Today, the company is denying claims in a short seller report from Gotham City. They're saying that the fraud alluded to by Gotham does not exist, and that's helping sentiment in that stock.
Joe, thanks so much. Joe Easton with the stocks to watch. Coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, on Russia and even Belarus. This is Bloomberg.
almost half of all American women in opposite-sex relationships now make the same or more than their husband. That's a record high. According to a new report by the Pew Research Center, a third of U.S. women are in egalitarian marriages, making roughly the same as their husbands, and another 15% of them are the breadwinners. Women with college degrees and no children, as well as Black women, are even more likely to make more or the same as their partners. But not everything is a bed of roses. Working wives still carry most of the weight of unpaid labor. Women in egalitarian marriages spend almost twice as much time taking care of the home or a loved one, while dedicating less time to leisure.
Women are continuing to go out in the formal labor market and contribute and are still bearing all of the load of responsibility that disproportionately falls on them in terms of family care.
During the pandemic, in the wake of school shutdowns, the height of the childcare crisis pushed nearly half of American women out of the labor force, a trend that's yet to be reversed.
Women are just really struggling to meet the care needs of their family, and at the same time are really, really leaning into the labor market. And I don't think we've seen this before in history, to be honest.
Information you want, analysis you trust. Everything you need to get set for the start of U.S. trading. Watch Bloomberg The Open with Jonathan Ferro. Weekdays on Bloomberg.
Welcome back to The Open, everyone. 30 minutes into the European trading day, and here are your top stories. Ukraine says Wagner mercenaries remain in the country after leader Yevgeny Prigozhin agrees to exile following aborted mutiny against Vladimir Putin. There are a few signs of market turmoil amid contained moves in oil, wheat, stocks, and currencies after the weekend events in Russia. Plus, China says it supports Russia's actions to maintain national stability as the nation's diplomats meet. Now, this is a look at the markets. It's a lot more calm than certainly we thought it would be on Saturday. But then it was a pretty dramatic set of events over the last 24 hours. From oil to gold to stocks and currencies, global markets seem to be, for the moment, a picture of relative calm in the wake of geopolitical shock that really shook Russia over the weekend. Now, we're trying to figure out a couple of things. First of all, does U.S. intelligence sharing still work between the U.S. and Europe? Second of all, if there were to be some kind of other affront with Vladimir Putin, what does that mean for the security of wheat and oil? And so how do you trade that? For the moment, markets just don't know how to trade it. We've been speaking to a lot of trading desks that say, look, you kind of look at the geopolitical risk and you're just waiting to figure out what happens next. That's not very tradable. European stocks down 0.4%. And this is one of the industries that we thought would be the most interesting to look at. So it's defense stocks. Of course, they benefit if there's some kind of escalation in armament to Ukraine. The other question, of course, is with the mutiny over the weekend, yes, it was aborted. We're not 100% sure what does next, but is now advantage Ukraine. The picture for some of these defense stocks, you can see Leonardo down 5%, Rheinmetall also down 3.7%, Dassault under pressure as well. Now let's also take some of the other sectors that are on the move. So we have 20 groups making up the stock 600. Actually, most of them are in the red. We have banks under pressure, real estate, auto parts, and then I'm just looking at some of the consumer goods gaining 0.1%. Now, Moscow's mayor says counter-terror measures that were put in place during the brief uprising by the Wagner mercenary group have been lifted. It's another sign of de-escalation following a dramatic weekend of events which posed the biggest threat to Russian President Vladimir Putin's almost quarter-century grip on power. Now, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo. So, Maria, what an extraordinary weekend. We saw a lot of unrest. Is the crisis now over for Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely, Francine. Extraordinary in this case is by no means an overstatement, especially on the Friday to the Saturday. Really did seem that the country was almost on the brink. And remember, the Russian president came out on national TV and talked about treason with fatal consequences. He almost compared this to 1917, which obviously is a critical and crucial date in Russian history. Now, when it comes to is it over for Vladimir Putin, what we know is that there is some kind of deal that was mediated by Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. Prigozhin pulled back and is now allegedly still alive and on his way to Belarus. And this morning, Francine, the optics coming out of the Kremlin is business as usual to some extent. We had pictures first thing in the morning today of Sergei Shoigu, that is the MOD, the head of the Russian Defense Ministry, on what seemed to be a helicopter, and he was expecting Russian troops. A lot of the messages that this is back to normal, back to business. But a lot of the officials that I spoke to, European officials already on the weekend, they told me whether this has substantial impact or not, a fatal wound to Vladimir Putin or not, it has many ways shaken and rattled this image of a man that was almost invincible, controlled everything. The KGB man definitely rattled by the events on the Saturday.
Yeah, and this is a strong man, so it's unclear after calling treason why then he wouldn't go after the Wagner chief. But a lot of the focus, Marianne, we have many questions, but a lot of the focus, of course, is on Alexander Lukashenko and the role he played of Belarus. You also spoke to the opposition leader, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. What did she tell you?
Yes, and Francine, you make a very good point. If you talked about treason, Vladimir Putin on the Saturday morning, how is it possible that Wagner has not been dismantled at this point and Prigozhin is still alive and somehow going to Belarus? And that is the key point for many. What's in this deal that Lukashenko allegedly negotiated between Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin? We did speak to Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. Remember, she challenged Alexander Lukashenko in the 2020 election in Belarus. The international community says, by the way, that Lukashenko rigged and faked the results of that election. And she said to me, he's not a peacemaker. There must be something in here for him, but he's not a good faith mediator. And also this could be now really dangerous for Belarus if they get stacked and drugged even more into the war. Let's take a look.
Yesterday day was rather tense for democratic forces who are in exile and people in Belarus, because any weakness of Putin's regime give us opportunity to uprise again in Belarus. And actually it started, this march of Prigozhin started unexpectedly, and unexpectedly it was finished. But I'm really honored how Belarusian democratic forces reacted on this event. The United Transitional Cabinet has created an operational headquarters where major groups and forces have joined. We worked on the common plan of actions. You know that our goal is to get rid of Russian troops, to dismantle Lukashenko regime, and to ensure the transition of democracy. And we really were ready to act yesterday. But now we see that the situation went differently, and now one more threat to Belarusian independence rose, because we have heard that Prigozhin can come to Belarus.
Yes. And what do you make of that? Because you say you aspire to a democratic Belarus, but at this point you have Lukashenko, Prigozhin, and the tactical nuclear weapons from Russia. Are you concerned about the future of your country at this point?
Look, I'm concerned about the future of my country since 2020, because we face dual crisis at the moment, humanitarian crisis inside the country, because repressions are continuing and intensifying. Thousands of people are in prisons, hundreds of thousands had to flee Belarus, but also we face a threat to our independence. Is because of nuclear weapon and presence of Russian forces in Belarus, and now possible Prigozhin's arrival to our country. Because as far as I understand, Prigozhin will likely not come alone, but he will come with his mercenaries. And for them, neither Belarus nor Ukraine should exist. So Prigozhin might be involved in military training, trade of arms, for example. It's not excluded that Prigozhin could be involved in another attack on Ukraine from Belarus territory. Who knows?
And that was Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She is the head of the opposition in Belarus. She challenged, again, just as a reminder, Alexander Lukashenko in the 2020 election. She's in exile. Her husband is in prison. And again, the message this morning is that Prigozhin going to Belarus is a danger to the country, but also repeating this message that Alexander Lukashenko is not just doing this for the good of his heart. He must have gotten something. The question is, what?
The question exactly is what, and maybe we'll find out, maybe we'll never know. It just feels there's like this eerie calm, Maria, and we wonder how long it can actually last. Maria Tadeo, they're in Brussels for us. Now let's get more on the challenge to President Putin's rule in Russia with Bloomberg's Mark Champion in Kyiv. Mark, I have to say it was a, incredible, unexpected, 24 hours. So what's been the reaction in Ukraine to Wagner's armed rebellion in Russia?
Well, initially just glee. The sort of sense across Ukraine was essentially anything that weakens Putin, anything that shakes the regime there must be good for Ukraine. The hope, obviously, was that, as much as they also disliked Prigozhin, the Ukrainians were very much hoping that he would make it all the way to Moscow and that this armed insurrection would continue. On the same basis. But, even now, the assumption is that this must benefit Ukraine simply because Putin will be weakened. That isn't a view shared, or at least, there's less certainty among Western diplomats here, whose concern is that, a weakened Putin could also react in other ways by doubling down. Prigozhin, after all, represented a sort of hawkish bunch of people in Russia, within the armed forces, within the security services, and beyond, who wanted to see the war prosecuted with more vigor and to see a nationwide mobilization for the war effort. So it's not quite clear, but the Ukrainians, for their part, they have been, very pleased by the turn of events.
So where does this leave the war in Ukraine, Mark? Does it make it, is it advantage Ukraine, or is it still unclear?
Well, so far it hasn't changed anything really. There are the daily movements on both sides. The Ukrainians have claimed some successes, but they're not really clearly linked to any sort of sudden failure on the Russian side of the lines that's linked to what Prigozhin did over the weekend. So, it's at the moment, it looks pretty much as it has in previous weeks. Ukraine obviously is engaged in a counteroffensive. The Russians had been pushing up back in the east, and the Ukrainians again pushing back for their part in the east also. So it looks pretty similar. In the longer term, as I say, the Ukrainians are hopeful that this will simply weaken the command and control, weaken morale on the Russian side, and that could have an impact on the battlefield.
All right, Mark, thanks so much. Mark Champion there, of course, in Kyiv, one of our senior correspondents who's been following the conflict since the very beginning. Now, let's also look at what European markets are doing right now. If you speak to a lot of traders, if you speak to a lot of trading floors, they just don't know how to trade the events of the last 72 hours. We're seeing a bit of pressure across the board. European stocks down some 0.5%. Oil, though, is rebounding after the Russia turmoil. And if you look at European stocks, are broadly steady. Now, investors, again, trying to assess the implications of this dramatic challenge to Putin's rule in Russia and potential further turmoil. But for that, you probably have to go into some of the industry groups, including defense, commodities, especially soft commodities such as wheat. Coming up, we dig a little deeper into the leader of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, who led an armed rebellion over the weekend. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
race relations in the United States are much better than when you were growing up in Mississippi, or do you think we've made less progress than you think we should have made?
Both. I think they're much better than when I was growing up. There's so many people who occupy areas and I never thought I would see them in. But I would have hoped it would be better. It's been a lot of progress, and somehow we're in an era now where, in spite of the progress, race relations in certain areas has become very scary. You know, some of the things that one reads about now remind me of growing up in Mississippi.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
This June, in honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month.
Now, an advisor to the Ukrainian President Zelensky says there have been no indications that the Wagner mercenary group is retreating from conflict areas in the country. That's after the leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has agreed to go into exile. Now, Russian officials met with key partners, including in China, a day after Prigozhin halted his advance towards Moscow. Now, joining us now to talk about more on this is Orysia Lutsevich, Deputy Director of Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. She also runs the Ukraine Forum. So thank you, Orysia, for joining us. I mean, it was a pretty incredible turn of events. What do you think happens next in the war? Is this an advantage for Ukraine?
Clearly, what has happened was challenge to Russia's leadership, and it's exposed the vulnerability of Kremlin's system, which is a succession. This is something that the markets and the experts are pondering. What comes in a moment of Russia when its leadership that seems invincible is challenged? And obviously, this is an advantage to Ukraine, partially because it's clear that President Putin himself can actually retreat from his position, which he did, between the statement he made and the deal that they've reached with Prigozhin. It means for Ukraine that it has to be armed to act from the position of strength and not to be rushed into too early and premature negotiations to settle this war too fast, too soon. That is not to Ukraine's advantage for its territorial integrity and sovereignty.
But, Orysia, and I understand that, of course, there's some kind of deal. I understand that also Prigozhin was after the head of the Ministry of Defense, who he really has it in for. But do we, Vladimir Putin is known to be quite volatile. We have in the past said that he could really go anything and do anything if he's cornered. Is he not cornered at the moment? What's worst case scenario?
Well, it's interesting you should mention this, because this is a perfect illustration to what happens when Putin is cornered. He actually retreated. He didn't lash out. He didn't stand up to the principle that Prigozhin is a traitor. He cut the deal because he understood what is at stake. And what was at stake is actually threat to his power. And I think this is what we must keep in mind, that this war will end when domestic political system in Russia will be under pressure. This is the only argument that elites in Kremlin understand, when their own hold on power and resources is challenged.
Orysia, what happens next? So it's unclear also what President Lukashenko is doing all of this. Does this put Belarus back on the spotlight? I mean, there's about, 15 ways this could unfold. What's your most likely scenario?
Well, let's remember that Belarus has been involved in this war from day one. Russia uses Belarusian territory to both launch attack on Kyiv, but also to keep Ukrainian territory under constant bombardment. to be honest, Lukashenko, I think, was the only leader that Putin called, and he called Kazakhstan, he called Turkey, who could not refuse Putin's offer to take Prigozhin, because Lukashenko is in a way hostage to a lot of situation around this war. Clearly, Belarus is very, very much nearing the border of the European Union, and I think that is why NATO, ahead of its Vilnius summit, should strengthen again the eastern flank of its border with Belarus, and should also strengthen Ukraine as much as possible by offering a clear pathway to membership. This is a time of now for action, because this will send a very, very strong signal to people like Lukashenko, like Putin, that they will not be able to make any advances.
Orysia, no, we haven't spent that much time trying to understand what Prigozhin's endgame was. Was he trying to scare off Putin to try and find a deal with the head of the armed forces? Or does he actually want to replace Putin? Because if we have President Prigozhin, this is a different game altogether for world security.
I think this incident gives us an opportunity to actually watch what is happening within Russian elite. Obviously, Prigozhin is not acting on his own. He must have some backers within the security and within the military. Let's remember, Prigozhin wants more war, not less war. He is running the mercenary group. So in this particular case, he wanted to probably put people from his milieu into the control. We'll have to watch now what kind of changes will take place. Who will be declared a traitor? So far, we have not seen anybody being blamed for, inspiring this mutiny. So from now on, the situation will evolve, and we will be able to read more with signs. But this is very, still very much the fog of this Prigozhin affair at the moment.
Orysia, thanks so much. Orysia Lutsevich there from Chatham House. Now, we're also getting some live images from, of course, Mr. Stoltenberg of NATO. He's saying that, look, they're not seeing any signs that Russia will use nuclear weapons. He says the weekend events are internal Russian matters. He is speaking with the president of Lithuania. They're holding a joint press conference at the presidential palace. Stoltenberg is in Lithuania with the permanent representative of the North Atlantic Council, and the chair of the military committee will, of course, monitor that press conference from Vilnius and bring you any more breaking news on that. Coming up, after a larger than expected rate hike last week, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says he still backs the Bank of England. We discuss the bank's inflation fight next, and this is Bloomberg. So Fabian, talk to me a little bit about the ocean. It covers 70% of the planet. It gives us food, it gives us jobs, it gives us, of course, oxygen. We're taking too many fish out, we're polluting it, we're making it warmer, and only 3% of it is protected. What frustrates you the most about this?
The basic frustration is our ignorance about how integral ocean is to not only our well-being, but to our existence. And for far too long, we've been using the ocean as an endless resource in a garbage can. Imagine our planet is a three-dimensional system. The ocean represents 99% of our world's living space, about 3.4 billion cubic kilometers of volume, within which the vast majority of biodiversity lives and thrives. And that's what we're beholden to. That is what makes us possible as a species.
This brings you the latest from China's 14th Annual National People's Congress, including China's COVID recovery, economic outlook, and geopolitical tensions. Continuing coverage this week on Bloomberg. Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
I think the Bank of England's track record, including the governor's track record, over a long period of time has been that inflation has been managed appropriately, and people should have the confidence that inflation will fall back to target as it is.
Not all of your colleagues think he's done a good job.
I can tell you as Prime Minister, the Bank of England is doing the right thing. The Bank of England has my total support.
Well, that was the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, saying that he fully backs the Bank of England. That's after the larger-than-expected rate hike to 5% last week. Now let's get more on the UK's fight to curb sticky inflation. For more, we're joined by Lizzie Burden, our UK correspondent. So, Lizzie, members of Sunak's own government had been critical of the BOE, but of course they're independent. It'd be very tricky for the Prime Minister, frankly, to go out front and blame the Bank of England, so he has not done that.
Yeah, and I mean, especially after what happened to Liz Truss last year, he knows not to even go there. It's not just that rates are now at 5%. Markets are now pricing for them to go to 6.25% by December, so that's higher and sooner than previously expected. As you heard there from Rishi Sunak, he's saying there's no alternative to this, even though he admits it's going to hurt. And actually, he takes pride in the fact that he was one of the first to talk about inflation being an issue, and as he puts it, he's taken difficult decisions not to make it worse. Now, the question is, are they going to do more to actively curb inflation with the levers at the government's disposal? We were just speaking to the former Chancellor Philip Hammond about this. He said it certainly isn't the time to be talking about tax cuts, but if you think about the options that are available, and there's a fantastic piece about this on the Terminal from Philip Aldrich over the weekend, you know, he could boost immigration to loosen the labour market. He could raise income taxes a la Bernie Sanders. He could go for wage price controls a la Richard Nixon, but none of those options are looking politically palatable.
But at the same time, we seem to have this possible two-pronged attack, you know, with the Bank of England trying to fight inflation, also the government. So we know that the Chancellor is meeting with regulatory bodies to try and keep inflation down, and also Rishi Sunak could push back recommendations and not increase wages for public sector workers.
Yes, but we know how this went with the supermarkets, right? So there were meetings with the food retailers. We've got food price inflation at 19%, and yet there was such strong outrage, pushback from the grocers that those talks kind of came to nothing. So yes, as you say, Hunt is going to meet the Competition Authority, also the Energy, Water and Communications watchdogs, and as you say, there is this talk about overriding the pay review bodies on public sector wages. But the unions are outraged, as you might expect. Let's see where these talks end up.
Let's see, Lizzie, thank you so much. As always, Lizzie Burden, there, our UK correspondent. Now, after a pause from the Fed and a 50 basis point hike from the BOE, top central bankers and policymakers will be speaking on the future of monetary policy and inflation. We'll be live from Sintra, Portugal, tomorrow and Wednesday for the annual ECB Forum and Central Bank. Now, tomorrow, Bloomberg will be speaking to the central bank governors of Latvia, Slovenia, and Lithuania, and also the Bank of England governor and the chief economist of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey and Hugh Pill, are both coming to Sintra as well. So we'll see for any indication of inflation fighting. We'll also look at what that means for assets across the board. For the moment, European stocks down some 0.2%. It's really defense stocks that are getting slammed in today's trading session, but it's also because over the last 3 months or so, they've increased significantly. Dassault Aviation down 4.8%. That's it for the European market open. Surveillance early edition is up next, and this is Bloomberg.
don't think we can replicate Tesla. Tesla is a unique because when they founded, and then the personality behind it, the product is beautiful, technologically very, very strong. So in many areas, Tesla is Tesla, but XPeng is XPeng. We want to focus on what we think is important for our customers. Our customer like beautifully designed vehicles, either it's large SUV or sports sedan. We believe we have a very, very appealing family look that our customers is really attracted to. They like to have user-friendly features inside the cabin that has a technology feel. It's very smart. It enables them to really utilize the vehicle that's different.
Our studios in New York and San Francisco. Our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch. Plus, the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action. 12 p.m. on the East Coast, 9 a.m. in the West. Only on Bloomberg Television, your global business authority. In a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
We indeed have a rally.
We're talking a lot of dividends. We're talking income.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Here's what's coming up on today's program. Russia's defense minister visits troops in Ukraine in the first appearance since Evgeny Prigozhin demanded his removal as Moscow lifts counter-terror measures put in place during the short-lived mutiny. Ukraine says Wagner mercenaries remain in the country after Prigozhin agrees to exile following an aborted uprising against Vladimir Putin. But there are a few signs of market turmoil amid contained moves in oil stocks and currencies after the weekend events in Russia. The ruble weakens, wheat gains. So let's take a look at the futures, or actually the markets. The futures in the U.S. Pretty much flat. European stocks down some 0.3%. Look, the big question, the billion-dollar question is why we're seeing so much calm in the markets after the pretty extraordinary weekend that we had in Russia. A couple of things that we need to watch out for. First of all, the focus firmly on what happens next. We don't know what kind of deal Prigozhin actually brokered with the help of Lukashenko with Vladimir Putin. The other question is this a clear advantage to Ukraine? It's probably too soon to tell, and we don't know whether this makes Vladimir Putin more unpredictable or not. For the moment, though, wheat stabilizing, oil stabilizing. We've also been speaking to a lot of traders who say, look, I just don't know how to trade it. They're figuring out what this means longer term, but there's not an actionable way of looking at some of these geopolitical risks. Euro dollar 108.94, and you can see Brent crude pretty much unchanged at 73.99. We're also getting some Germany June IFO expectations. It'd be interesting to see whether it changes on the back of this pretty extraordinary weekend. So it's coming in at 88, actually business confidence index coming in at 88.5. The estimate was 90.7. So we're seeing a bit of weakness across the board. And that's both, I think, for expectations, which are lower than expected, but also how they assess the current situation on the markets in Germany. The picture for euro dollar, you can see 108.95, and then we go to Sintra, Portugal, for a full roundup and full conversations with a lot of central banks to try and figure out what inflation does from here on in. Now, Moscow has lifted counter-terror measures put in place during mercenary leader Evgeny Prigozhin's brief mutiny over the weekend. And Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has visited combat troops in Ukraine in his first public outing since the weekend's dramatic events. Now, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo. Maria, extraordinary weekend is probably an understatement. What does this crisis mean for Vladimir Putin? Is it over, or is it just the beginning?
And yes, Francine, and you mentioned at the top of the show, and this is something we should really focus on, this idea that Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has magically reappeared this Monday morning. It was the first thing in the morning that we got from the Russian media outlets. And you see Shoigu on what appears to be a helicopter, and he is inspecting troops in this war in Ukraine. And the reason why this matters is because we know very well that a lot of what happened over the weekend, really the core of the issue, were the tensions between Prigozhin, Wagner, and obviously Shoigu and the MOD. Prigozhin was very critical in the way that the Russian army was fighting this war. This morning, it appears that the message the Kremlin wants to send to the world is that it is business as usual and that Shoigu is still very much in his job and now inspecting troops. Now, when it comes to Vladimir Putin, it's difficult to gauge because he's gone now radio silent. But one of the fundamental things here, and it's really one of the big questions, is on the Saturday morning, he told the Russian people they were witnessing treason. He talked about fatal and critical consequences. He almost drew a parallel with 1917. That is a crucial moment in Russian history. And yet, on the Monday morning, Francine, no sight of Vladimir Putin. The charges of mutiny have been dropped on Wagner. Prigozhin allegedly is still alive and going to Belarus. What this means, what kind of deal was cut here, is still very, very unclear. The one thing I would say is that we just heard from the top European diplomat, Josep Borrell, who says Vladimir Putin created a monster and that monster has come back to haunt him. The image of Vladimir Putin as the all-powerful leader has been rattled by Prigozhin. Whether he stays in Russia or goes to Belarus, that impact has already happened.
Yes, and what's incredible is actually, again, we're very, very thin on details. It's unclear why the mercenaries turned around. A lot of focus is on Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus and the role he played into all of this. And you spoke to the opposition leader. So what did she tell you, Maria?
Yes, and Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin have a history that goes back decades, and they also have a very transactional relationship at times. And we did speak to Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She challenged Lukashenko in the 2020 election, and what she said is, look, if you think that Alexander Lukashenko is the hero of the day and he's doing this for the good of his heart, you're wrong. Let's take a look.
Lukashenko is not a peacemaker. You know, he now presented as mediator in this issue, but he was rather Putin's messenger. Lukashenko passed the message to Prigozhin, which allowed Prigozhin to stop the march and save face. Somehow, I can say that Lukashenko saved Putin, but it doesn't make Lukashenko a hero, you know, in this situation. The problem is that the interests of Belarusians are not considered at all.
And that was Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She is the opposition leader of Belarus. And again, one thing that she reiterated is that the country, her country, Belarus, now finds itself in a rather dangerous position. On the one hand, you have Lukashenko with a murky deal. The details are not clear. Prigozhin going that way, but also the tactical nuclear weapons. Let's not forget that Vladimir Putin has said that he will station some more in Belarus.
Maria, thanks so much. Maria Tadeo there in Brussels, of course, following this conflict from the very beginning. Let's also get more on what this all means for the future of the war in Ukraine. We're joined by our Mark champion in Kiev. Mark, you have unparalleled insights into what this could mean for the war going forward. It's extremely difficult at this point, given all of the questions that we still have to fully understand it. But what's been the reaction in Ukraine of Wagner's armed rebellion in Russia?
Well, it was very much welcomed. The basic calculation in Ukraine is binary, really. Anything that is bad for the Kremlin, anything that is bad for Putin should be good for Ukraine. The assumption is that this will, they had hoped, obviously, that this would continue and there would be more destabilization in Moscow. So they're a little bit more cautious now. But nevertheless, they still believe that no matter what happens, Putin has been weakened and that should help. How exactly it will help, they don't know yet. On the battlefield, we've seen really more of the same. We haven't seen any obvious linkage, any impact coming from the events of the weekend onto the battlefield. And the Ukrainians hope that in the longer term, this will create problems with morale, problems with command and control in the Russian forces. But equally, there are, Western diplomats here who also issue a word of caution, which is that we can't be sure that the response to this won't be that Putin actually feels he has to kind of double down on the war. Right. Prigozhin, after all, was demanding a more effective war. Not he criticized the conduct of the war. He criticized the reasoning for the war, but nevertheless he supported it and was asking for a much tougher approach.
But very quickly, Mark, I mean, do we know what the deal is? Could it see, I mean, President Prigozhin for the world means more instability and actually a far more, I guess, unstable and live wire than even President Putin is. So do we know what the agreement is? Will we know? And can Vladimir Putin really one day call him, a treason, and then the second day let him get away with it?
Well, we don't know what the deal is. We really have no idea, to be quite frank. We don't know where Prigozhin is. We don't know what's going to happen to his forces. There was some indication that they were going to be given the opportunity to sign contracts with the regular military in Russia. But we don't know exactly, we don't know if what Wagner will continue in the form that it has now. But what is clear is that Prigozhin felt the need to stand down. Whatever the deal is, it is not perfect for him. And he felt the need to stand down, and the likely reason for that is that although the Russian military did not rush to oppose him, they also, even his friends in the military, including one of the commanders in Ukraine, did not support him. So he may simply have decided that 4,000 or so troops was not enough.
All right, Mark, thank you so much. Mark Champion there in Kiev, Ukraine. Now, we're also joined by the Deutsche Bank chief economist, David Forkerts-Landau. David, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Now, we're going to have a robust conversation on inflation, on U.S. recession, but actually it's unclear from a market perspective or an economist perspective to look at how these dramatic effects in Russia could change the war, could change wheat, and could actually change our world economy.
Good morning, Francine. It's good to be here. Well, it's been a roller coaster weekend, but by and large, today, as we see it this morning, it's a disaster averted in the sense that if Poroshenko had been successful in moving on to Moscow, you would then have an ultra-nationalist with potential access to nuclear weapons, not necessarily, but potentially, and I think it would have been truly catastrophic. That's been averted. So what we have now is a somewhat weaker Putin, not very much, not as much as some commentators indicated, but certainly we have some weaknesses here and there. And he will pursue the war in Ukraine as before, but there is some doubts. So I think on the whole, this morning, we probably are in a better position than we were last Thursday, because one thing has been removed, avoided, and the main protagonist is weaker. So from that point of view, I would expect us to be quite positive once sort of markets feel their way through this, to be positive in the coming days.
Does the change? I mean, everybody cares about how this war ends and who wins. Does it actually have an impact on the economy of the world?
Very indirectly. As you know, Russia didn't play that much of a role. Once we worked our way through the gas problem and the oil problem, the rest of it wasn't that important. But it does have an impact through defense stocks and generally through sort of a sentiment, particularly among investors and among their firms. So there is certainly a negative indirect impact that we have seen, and it will continue to be there because it is an uncertainty. You have a land war in Europe with a nuclear power with a guy who's, we don't quite know how he might react in extreme situations. So.
David, we're lucky to have you today, actually, because you're great at thinking of different things. Or do you worry about where we are at this juncture in time for the world economy? Again, we look at policy from the Fed, we look at policy Bank of England and ECB, and I don't know whether a mistake could happen because they raised too quickly.
No, I do not. Unlike most in my profession, I tend to be fairly optimistic about where the world economy is going. I believe that the short term is an issue in Europe and in the US because we have to work our way through the inflation problem without causing a deep recession. But in the medium term, if you think 2 years ahead, there's nothing but good news. We've seen the major technological innovation that is going to increase productivity, and I would expect that if we were sitting here again 3 years from now, everything would look an awfully lot better than it is today. So from that point of view, yeah, I'm quite optimistic about where we're going in the medium term.
I know you have a pretty, well, one of the most aggressive calls when it comes to recession in the U.S., which we'll talk about shortly. But are you not concerned, or are you not perplexed at the fact that we managed to raise interest rates from 0.5 or 1% to 4.5% without anything major breaking?
Well, anybody who is perplexed about that probably doesn't know what he's doing. For all of those who have watched past cycles, this is a totally unexpected world, and we don't really know exactly what's going on. So you have an unusually strong labor market. Let's look at the German unemployment rate is below 3% by OECD measures, and yet you have core inflation being very sticky, with both the Fed and the ECB having gone up by a very significant amount in rates, and we don't see as much of an impact, or even close to what we would have expected. So yeah, I think perplexed is about the right word, but I think it'll resolve itself. It's just take a lot more time, and there is scope for policy errors. There's scope for overshooting on the upside, producing a recession that's deeper than it would need to be. There's also scope for undershooting it and keeping inflation and then having it feed into wages and producing a cycle. So this is a very demanding period for central bank policy making.
All right, so David,
if I might just add one thing, the one problem here is that you have the fiscal monetary problem that we had in the 5-8 years ago in reverse now. You have fiscal policy being very expansionary and monetary policy contractionary, and that isn't helping. So in some sense, monetary policy has to work a lot harder to get the fiscal stimulus down, and that's a bit unfortunate. But
it is what it is. David, we'll talk a lot more about that. We're going to just pay for some ad and then come back. Deutsche Bank Chief Economist David Folkert-Landau, he stays with us. We'll talk not only, of course, about some of what monetary policy can do to counter some of the fiscal policy, but also how traders should invest in this outlook. Coming up, we'll have plenty more with the Deutsche Bank Chief Economist. Also, we'll look at gold. We'll look at some of the other things that we're watching out for in today's trading session. This is Bloomberg.
The deal was the brainchild of Apollo CEO Mark Rowan. In January, Apollo closed its $11 billion all-stock merger with Athene Holding. It had already owned 35% of the insurer. Here's what Apollo gets out of the deal. Assets under management. Apollo expects them to double to about $1 trillion by 2026. Much of that projected growth will come from the merger, and those assets are especially attractive to Apollo. Insurance companies typically go after much more modest returns than buyout investors. That will give Apollo more options for investing the cash. Athene is a steady provider of fee income. It has grown into one of the nation's biggest holders of fixed annuities, those retirement savings products favored by risk-averse customers. The merger will also allow Apollo to simplify its governance. It gave up its dual-class share structure and adopted a one-share, one-vote plan. The hope is that will eventually lead to Apollo's inclusion in the S&P 500. People ask me all the time, what is the key to being a really good investor? And I tell them it's to surround yourself with and work with the best investors you can find. On Bloomberg Wealth, I'm going to take you to meet the greatest investors in the world, the people that I would like to have managing my money.
The climate is one thing that connects everybody across the globe. And if we don't do something about it, it brings down the value of all companies.
Welcome back. We talk about the economy and the intersection with the markets with the Deutsche Bank chief economist David Folkert-Landau, who's still with us. David, thank you so much for sticking around. When you look at some of what you're expecting in terms of a U.S. recession, how does that compare with, for example, the European economy? I know they're in different cycles, and of course they're reacting to different monetary policy.
Well, the price dynamics in Europe is somewhat different in the sense that it's slower to catch up, so prices will stay higher, inflation will stay higher, and for longer. And what we see now is wage settlements feeding into that. Because basically, wage settlements occur rather infrequently, and you want to catch up and bring real wages to where they were before the pandemic. And that's going to take a while. Now we see moving in that direction, but it will take another couple of years before we get there. So I think the wage price dynamics, because of unionization is larger in the European sector, will be a lot more detrimental to inflation, will keep it higher for longer. So we believe that the ECB will probably have to go to a 4% terminal rate. I know the market's betting on 3.75, but 4% would not surprise me at all.
Do you worry about Germany, actually, in particular, because of innovation, but also because of the proximity to the war?
This is it's almost a historic pivot in the sense that the Europeans and the Germans in particular, because of the large manufacturing sector, falling very much behind the US because of the technological gap is getting wider and wider, very difficult to close, with generative AI now coming on top of that. But also the change in US policy towards a very aggressive industrial policy. Almost $2 trillion for the IRA and the CHIP Act and the Infrastructure Act. And we see very, very significant plans for the next wave of investment in sort of high-tech green industries moving from Europe into the US. Our sense is it's probably about 20% of planning that was supposed to be in Europe for CapEx is going to move to the US. And that'll hurt. That'll hurt productivity. It'll hurt the outlook. So I think when you think in terms of problems, yes, I think the short term is, one has to watch it, but it's manageable. What is really the core issue right now in Europe and in Germany in particular is the medium-term outlook and how to overcome that.
David, thanks so much. David Folkert-Landau, there, Deutsche Bank chief economist. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, on the markets, and we'll try and figure out how traders are gauging the impact of the Russian instability. We'll discuss that next, and this is Bloomberg. What do you like most about your job?
I think the people. I mean, ultimately, we're a people business. A lot of what my job is as CEO of the company is to give those people sort of motivation, to tell them where we're going, to encourage them to come up and do their best work, to encourage them to collaborate. Sometimes you sort of think you're almost a psychologist, as you are a business leader, I think, sometimes.
And so what's your best piece of advice?
I love pitches. I love being sort of leading from the front, if you like, and spending times with teams. I love to see the work that we're doing. When we pitch for a piece of new business, often when we come together. So I guess I try and put myself in the seat of the client. Now, what's the client going to think when they see this work? Are they going to be excited? Is it going to turn their brand around? How's it going to resonate with their consumers? So as much as possible, I think probably I try and play that role.
What's happening on Wall Street?
There are so many factors at play today.
It remains tight in certain parts of the economy.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Crisis is too strong a word, and words like that get used a lot.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
America's economy needs a diversity of institutions. That's something that Wall Street pays a lot of attention to.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
Good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets trying to open.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
And welcome to Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Investors have been assessing the implications of the dramatic challenge to Vladimir Putin's rule in Russia and the potential for further turmoil. Now let's get more on that market reaction with our Bloomberg MLive Ven Ram. Ven, thank you for joining us. Why are the markets actually so calm about it all? Is it because they don't know how to trade it, or they're just waiting for news on the deal?
Morning, Francine. I think that it is more like they're intrigued by what happened in Russia over the weekend and something that started and ended over the weekend, but they aren't necessarily pricing much yet because they don't know how to price it. What is there to price is the question that seemed to be dominant on traders' minds because, as I said, the coup seems to have ended for now, and therefore there is not much of a visible pricing. We have seen a bit for gold, but if the situation in Kremlin is contained, as appears to be the case now, then those gains aren't very well founded. From a market's perspective, I would be concerned about what happens to natural gas prices, and that's edging higher slightly because of what it means to supply and the euro area inflation picture. But at the moment, the markets are thinking, well, if this is contained, then perhaps this is all we need to price in.
So, Ven, what does that mean going forward? I mean, what kind of asset class would you be looking at?
I would be primarily looking at gold. If there is a protracted, if there are protracted tensions around Kremlin, I think gold will see a bid. We have already seen gold march higher by 0.5%, and those gains can continue if there is a protracted tension. But of course, over the longer term, you want to see how that is going to play against the narrative where the Fed wants to keep going.
All right, Ven, thank you so much, as always. Ven Ram there from our Bloomberg MLive team. Coming up this weekend, Vladimir Putin faced the biggest challenge to his 2-decade rule. We'll discuss more with the former UK ambassador to Russia. Don't miss that. It's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Say race relations in the United States are much better than when you were growing up in Mississippi, or do you think we've made less progress than you think we should have made?
Both. I think they're much better than when I was growing up. There's so many people who occupy areas I never thought I would see them in. But I would have hoped it would be better. It's been a lot of progress. And somehow we're in an era now where, in spite of the progress, race relations in certain areas has become very scary. You know, some of the things that one reads about now remind me of growing up in Mississippi.
Business Week Radio, live weekday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern.
We got a little bit of talking.
Come on, are you guys ready?
Harnessing the power of Bloomberg Business Week, Carol Masser and Tim Stanivek bring you the latest news from the worlds of business, technology, politics, and more.
How does the Fed play into this and what the Fed does potentially?
This is so exhausting and this is so all-encompassing.
Listen on Bloomberg Radio and streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals.
Russia's defense minister visits troops in Ukraine. In his first appearance since Yevgeny Prigozhin demanded his removal as Moscow lifts counter-terror measures put in place during the short-lived mutiny. Ukraine says Wagner mercenaries remain in the country after Prigozhin agrees to exile following an aborted uprising against Vladimir Putin. But there are a few signs of market turmoil amid contained moves in oil stocks and currencies after the weekend events in Russia. The ruble weakens and weak gains. Now, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacroix here in London. Now, it's been a dramatic weekend after the impact of the Wagner mercenary group's advance towards Moscow, the biggest threat to Russian President Vladimir Putin's almost quarter-century grip on power. Now, for more on all of this, let's get straight to Bloomberg's Roz Matheson. Roz, thank you for joining us. You always make sense of inexplicable events, and we saw probably the most dramatic events that not many people were expecting over the weekend. Like, what exactly did we just live through? Was it a mutiny to come to power? Did he retreat because he didn't have the capability of going to Moscow, or did he really broker a good deal?
Well, we're truly in a moment where there's just a lot we don't know. What we do know is that Prigozhin says that he did not want to topple Vladimir Putin. He was wanting the removal of the top commanders in Russia's military, particularly the defense minister, who's been very, very publicly critical of for months now. So he wanted changes in the military establishment. He said he didn't want to confront Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin said, this is a mutiny against me, really, and so it did set them up for that showdown. It's unclear what happened really in the end with this deal that seems to have been brokered by the Belarusians, like that enabled Prigozhin to pull back his troops from Moscow and pull them seemingly further back into Ukraine. But the question is, where is he now? Where are his men? Is he going to Belarus? And if so, what's he going to do there? What kind of arrangements were made behind the scenes that we simply just don't know about? Did he get some kind of understanding? We might yet see some changes in the Russian military establishment, perhaps in weeks or months from now. What was the trade-off? And if anything, what did also Vladimir Putin, if anything, get out of this moment?
I mean, this is what's kind of like eerily quiet almost, right? I mean, it's very uncharacteristic for Vladimir Putin not to come out today or, certainly pardon Prigozhin, who also has been quiet. So what, I mean, the million-dollar question is, when do we find out? But is it impossible also to tell at this point what happens next?
Well, we may never know exactly what happened, but what we do know, as you say, there's been radio silence from both Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin. Today, the message from Russia and the Kremlin seems to be, this happened, we'll move on, it's business as usual. We've got Shoigu in Ukraine, we've got fighting going on the ground in Ukraine, Russian troops are still there, the streets of Moscow are back to normal, we've got markets are going to trade again, all the roadblocks have been removed, nothing to see here. Here we go, and that seems to be what the state television, state media is pushing, and perhaps again why Putin has not come out in public, because he might feel that doing so suggests there's still more going on here, and that seems to be really what the Kremlin is trying to do. But the real question in the end is, like, despite this moment, even if things do quieten down, what does it mean for Vladimir Putin in the longer term?
Yeah, 100% the question that we're trying to find out. Ross, thank you so much, as ever, Ross Matheson there. Now let's also bring in Laurie Bristow, who was the UK's ambassador to Russia until 2020. So, Ambassador Bristow, you know Vladimir Putin. I think you've negotiated with him. You know his inner thinking, his inner circle. How did this weekend shape out? It's quite uncharacteristic for him to say, look, they're traitors, there's treason, and then forgive them.
Yeah, good morning. It's really hard to make sense of what happened over the weekend. I mean, what Prigozhin thought he was doing, was this a mutiny? Was it an attempted coup? Why Mr. Putin and the Kremlin went inside a day from talking about traitors and attempts to overthrow the state to essentially all charges dropped, nothing really to see here. And of course, this morning, very clear attempts to give the impression, at least, of return to normality in Moscow, and Defense Minister Shoigu, appearing on television. But I think the best way to understand what's happening here is as a product of the weaknesses and failings of the Russian state under Mr. Putin. So weak institutions, strong patronage networks, competing interests within the elite. And the way I've described it in the past on many occasions is it's a bit like a tank of piranhas. The piranhas are happy as long as the food keeps coming in. When the food stops coming in, the piranhas eye each other up. What happens next, I think we should see this as one act in a drama that will continue to run. I don't think we've by any means seen the end of this yet.
But so, Ambassador, first of all, if, Prigozhin wanted to take Moscow, could have he taken it? Again, from the outside, it's very unclear how much support he had from military high-ranking officials.
Well, of course, we may never know the answer to that question. What he did do was take to the airwaves openly criticizing the basis of the invasion of Ukraine, the idea that it was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. He then seized control of the Southern Military Command headquarters in Rostov. This is a really, really big deal. And then set off, with his men on a long drive to Moscow. What he planned to do once he got to Moscow, it's possible he hadn't even properly thought that through. I mean, the idea that you could turn up in Moscow, with even a substantial number of men and take the place over, this just defies belief, really. As to the deal, I don't know what happened there. Again, we may never know the full details of that. What I am sure of, though, is that Mr. Putin will not forgive and forget.
What does that mean for actually Putin's tenure? Could we actually see him replaced? And we heard from National Security Intelligence that actually it would be a real problem for many countries around the world as Prigozhin would be the next president, especially if he had the nuclear arms. I mean, he is more unstable and highly volatile, even compared to Vladimir Putin.
I think we can pretty much rule out the idea that Mr. Prigozhin will be the next president of Russia. I think what happened over the weekend has seriously damaged Mr. Putin. A lot of it, I think, is self-harm. He looks damaged, and I think this is a consequence of the way that he's come to run Russia in recent years. And I think in his speech on the Saturday morning, his address to the nation on the Saturday morning, the reference to 1917 and the stab in the back was a bad error. I mean, that implies that Russia is susceptible to some sort of revolution or coup. Absolutely not the message I think he wanted to be sending. I mean, the idea that there might be some sort of palace coup, someone seek to overthrow him, I find that quite implausible at the moment. It would be a highly risky venture for anyone to undertake that. By the way, I think it's absolutely implausible that the West would wish to be seen to have any hand in this. I mean, the best thing Western governments can do is stay well clear of this. I think what we're now seeing is a period of uncertainty and essentially trying to work out what to do within the Russian system itself. As regards Russia's standing with its international partners, again, I think that's quite seriously damaged. I think that people like Xi Jinping will be looking at Moscow this morning and just trying to work out what on earth is going on.
So, Ambassador, are we going to see changes to either tactically, how Russia continues its war in Ukraine, or actually changes at the top of the defense ministry? Was it for money that Prigozhin backed away, or was it for changes?
We don't know why Prigozhin backed away. I think the things to watch with regard to the war are any impact on morale of the army, the Russian army fighting in Ukraine, any impact on its capabilities. What we will not see, I think, is any change in the fundamental goals of Putin and the Russian state. Their goal is to subjugate or to break Ukraine. As regards the politics, I think what we will see here is a continued period, possibly quite a long period, of uncertainty about where things are going. Bear in mind that there is, in theory at least, a presidential election due in Russia next year. And whatever the plan for that was, whether it was another term in power for Mr. Putin or some sort of managed succession, I think that just got much harder.
Ambassador, do we know how much the people inside Russia understand what happened over the weekend? Again, I think there were reports that Russia 24 was, for example, looking at a documentary on Berlusconi at the time. Because if Vladimir Putin is weakened, that will affect morale of the troops.
Yeah. So the Russian state has pretty much total control over the TV and radio media. And I'm sure that they will be using that over the coming weeks and months to try and reassert a sense of normality and grip and purpose at the top. The bigger question here, I think, is the sense that there is something just changed, something just happened, and nobody really quite knows what to make of that. What I think the Kremlin's response will be even deeper repression. We've seen plenty of repression in the last year since the invasion started. I would fully expect that now to double down.
What do we know about what the leader in Belarus, what role he has to play? He was involved from the very beginning, but this is really taking on a much, much bigger role.
So again, there's a great deal we don't know about either the deal or, if there was one, or the means by which it came about. Personally, I find it deeply implausible that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, played a brokering role in that. He's not a strong enough figure. He's not taken seriously enough by, I think, any of the main players. My guess is that he was possibly used as a conduit for messages rather than somebody who brokered a deal.
Do you think the West had any dealing in this? I mean, we're also hearing from various media reports that U.S. intelligence knew about this, did not inform Europe. But then there's, a second train of thought saying that actually it was probably the West that was behind this. We're not sure to what avail, but do you refute that?
There will certainly be allegations of that in the Russian propaganda over the coming days. And over the weekend, former President Medvedev pretty much said that there were the hands of foreign agencies in this. That's a standard propaganda reaction to try to transfer internal tensions and problems onto some sort of external malign forces. I just go back, though, to what Mr. Putin himself said on Saturday morning with the reference to 1917 and the reference to traitors from within. That was the way it was being spun on Saturday morning. One final point on this, though, it's critically important that Western governments don't feed the fear or the anxiety in Russia that they might be behind this. I'm pretty sure they weren't, and there is no interest in Western governments in being seen to be playing that role.
Ambassador, is this an advantage for Ukraine, and what does it mean for how they drive the war forward?
It's certainly positive from Ukraine's point of view, but what I would not do is make a quick jump from that to any suggestion that the war is nearly over or that Ukraine has a clear strategic advantage on the battlefield. I think they will continue to face a very tough fight. A lot more people, unfortunately, are going to die in that war. We should keep coming back to the fact that the war was launched illegally and unnecessarily by Mr. Putin against Ukraine.
Does it change, though, the parameters, actually? I mean, one question that I haven't asked you yet is, we always have said in the past that if Vladimir Putin is cornered, you really don't know what he'll do. Do you think he's cornered right now?
I wouldn't say he's cornered, and I'd also advise against the logic that we should give Putin something of what he wants because we might get worse if we don't. I think we're long past the stage where any attempt to appease or buy Mr. Putin off will lead to better results than essentially facing him down. Nobody wants direct conflict here between NATO and Russia. We don't want it. Russia doesn't want it, and both sides have gone to great lengths so far. And I think in the future to avoid that happening. But that doesn't change the fundamentals here, that what Mr. Putin has done is deeply dangerous, certainly to Ukraine, but also to wider European security and stability.
Ambassador, thank you so much for all of your insight. Laurie Bristow, their former UK ambassador to Russia. Now to Greece, and it's a landslide victory for Kyriakos Mitsotakis in the country's second vote in just over a month. The win gives the former prime minister a majority big enough to form a single-party government. Now markets have previously rallied behind him as he made the economy central to his campaign. Coming up, more on the short-lived meeting in Russia. We'll be joined by political scientist Ekaterina Shulman. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg.
I don't think we can replicate Tesla. Tesla is a unique because when they founded and then the personality behind it, the product is beautiful, technologically very, very strong. So in many areas, Tesla is Tesla, but Xpeng is Xpeng. We want to focus on what we think is important for our customers. Our customer like beautifully designed vehicles, either it's large SUV or sports sedan. We believe we have a very, very appealing family look that our customers is really attracted to. They like to have user-friendly features inside the cabin that has a technology feel. It's very smart. It enables them to really utilize the vehicle that's different.
UK, your source for news and analysis covering the biggest challenges facing the UK government, economy, financial services and markets.
Tax cuts should not be the priority. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
In this post-Brexit world, how do you see actually servicing your clients?
It was disruptive, and it's going to have implications to how capital raising works.
Now we're having the perfect storm in the UK.
Watch Francine Lacqua Thursdays at 9:30 a.m. only on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Yesterday day was rather tense for democratic forces who are in exile and people in Belarus, because any weakness of Putin's regime gave us opportunity to uprise again in Belarus. And actually it started, this march of Prigozhin started unexpectedly, and unexpectedly it was finished. But I'm really honored how Belarusian democratic forces reacted on this event. The United Transitional Cabinet has created an operational headquarters where major groups and forces have joined. We worked on the common plan of actions. You know that our goal is to get rid of Russian troops, to dismantle Lukashenko regime, and to ensure the transition of democracy. And we really were ready to act yesterday. But now we see that the situation went differently, and now one more threat to Belarusian independence rose, because we have heard that Prigozhin can come to Belarus.
Yes. And what do you make of that? Because you say you aspire to a democratic Belarus, but at this point you have Lukashenko, Prigozhin, and the tactical nuclear weapons from Russia. Are you concerned about the future of your country at this point?
Look, I'm concerned about the future of my country since 2020, because we face dual crisis at the moment, humanitarian crisis inside the country, because repressions are continuing and intensifying. Thousands of people are in prisons, hundreds of thousands had to flee Belarus, but also we face a threat to our independence. Is because of nuclear weapon and presence of Russian forces in Belarus, and now possible Prigozhin's arrival to our country. Because as far as I understand, Prigozhin will likely not come alone, but he will come with his mercenaries. And for them, neither Belarus nor Ukraine should exist. So Prigozhin might be involved in military training, trade of arms, for example. It's not excluded that Prigozhin could be involved in another attack on Ukraine from Belarus territory. Who knows?
Well, that was the Belarusian opposition leader expressing her concerns for her country's future after the impact of the Wagner mercenary group's mutiny. Now, coming up, more on this weekend's developments in Russia. We'll have a full roundup of what this means for the next couple of months and beyond. This is Bloomberg.
The deal was the brainchild of Apollo CEO Mark Rowan. In January, Apollo closed its $11 billion all-stock merger with Athene Holding. It had already owned 35% of the insurer. Here's what Apollo gets out of the deal. Assets under management. Apollo expects them to double to about $1 trillion by 2026. Much of that projected growth will come from the merger, and those assets are especially attractive to Apollo. Insurance companies typically go after much more modest returns than buyout investors. That will give Apollo more options for investing the cash. Athene is a steady provider of fee income. It has grown into one of the nation's biggest holders of fixed annuities, those retirement savings products favored by risk-averse customers. The merger will also allow Apollo to simplify its governance. It gave up its dual-class share structure and adopted a one-share, one-vote plan. The hope is that will eventually lead to Apollo's inclusion in the S&P 500.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
This is Bloomberg.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacroix here in London. Now, Wagner mercenary group leader Evgeny Prigozhin dramatically halted his advance towards Moscow after reaching a deal with the Kremlin to end his armed uprising. Now, Prigozhin was once an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, but has become a fierce critic of the Russian military for its failures during Moscow's war in Ukraine. Well, Bloomberg's Samuel Etienne reports.
Is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former caterer who went on to lead a powerful mercenary group that marched on Moscow. Born in 1961, Prigozhin was a petty criminal in his early life and was jailed for nearly a decade. He later became a hot dog seller and then involved in several businesses, including catering. Through this, Prigozhin became known as Putin's chef, personally serving food to the Russian leader at dinners with dignitaries. The two appeared to share a close relationship. In late 2022, Prigozhin admitted to being the founder and head of Wagner, a Russian private military contractor. This after years of denials and even using European courts to sue those who suggested he led the group. The mercenary unit had close links to the Russian military and intelligence community. Wagner, set up 8 years earlier in 2014, was utilized in the capture and occupation of eastern Ukraine. Prigozhin's group extended the Kremlin's influence overseas. while allowing Moscow the ability to deny any involvement in any of the group's operations. Wagner has been identified in aiding governments fighting conflicts and stamping out dissent in the Central African republics, Syria, Libya, Mali, and Sudan. Wagner's fighters have been involved in some of the fiercest fighting in Ukraine, notably in the capture of Bakhmut in the east. Prigozhin turned to recruiting criminals from prison with the promise of freedom. Hit by heavy casualties, Prigozhin grew increasingly vocal in his criticism of Russia's conflict in Ukraine and military strategy. The Wagner chief directly blamed Defense Minister Shoigu for a lack of ammunition and weaponry. Prigozhin later claimed Defense Minister Shoigu ordered an airstrike on Wagner troops and retaliated by sending his contractors to take and hold towns in Russia in what he called a march for justice to Moscow. At the time, Vladimir Putin saw this as treason.
All those who deliberately embarked on the path of betrayal, who prepared an armed rebellion, embarked on the path of blackmail and terrorist methods.
While Prigozhin, later calling off his march, said he was loyal to Putin.
As for betraying the motherland, the president was very deeply mistaken. We are patriots of our homeland. We have fought and are fighting.
Bloomberg's Samuel Etienne there on the leader of the Wagner Group. Now, we're getting some breaking news out of Brussels. The EU Council actually agreeing on a €3.5 billion top-up package to arms fund used for Ukraine. So they've just lifted a ceiling of European peace facility to more than 12 billion euros. Again, it was only 4 or 5 days ago, before this dramatic weekend, that we were here in London looking at the Ukraine, reconstruction fund, and now the EU Council has agreed to put more money in it. So let's remind you of a pretty dramatic development over the weekend. On Friday, Evgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner private military group, called the Russian military evil in an audio message. The next morning, Wagner took control of the Russian military headquarters in the strategically important southern city of Rostov-on-Don. Now, President Putin delivered a televised speech and vowed to crush the rebellion that has Wagner units headed towards Moscow. Later on Saturday, in a truce brokered by Belarus, Prigozhin said the Wagner column would halt in advance and return to camp. In exchange, Putin guaranteed Prigozhin's safe passage to Belarus and said he would not be prosecuted. The deal also allowed Wagner fighters to join the Russian army. Now, the Kremlin said fighting in Ukraine had not been affected. Now, after a pause from the Fed and a 50 basis point hike from the BOE, top central bankers and policymakers will be speaking on the future of monetary policy and inflation. We'll be live from Sintra, Portugal tomorrow and Wednesday for the annual ECB Forum on Central Banks. Now, we'll be speaking to the central bank governors of Latvia, Slovenia, and Lithuania tomorrow. We have plenty more exclusives the day after. I'm also looking forward to hearing from Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England. His chief economist, Hugh Bill, will also be there. Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Kriti Gupta in New York, Tom McKenzie here in London, and this is Bloomberg.
So is there more pressure when you're trying to win a basketball championship than when you're trying to please investors? Where's the greater pressure?
Oh, I think
I think it's definitely trying to win a championship. It's hard because a lot of, like when you invest, and you know this, when you're investing, you can control a lot more things. When, you know, on a basketball court, you can't control whether somebody's going to make a shot. You've got to get lucky.
And what's the greater pleasure, making 5 times your money on a distressed debt investment or winning the NBA championship?
They're both fabulous. I wish I could do one each year. That would be great. But I think there's a great feeling in being right on an investment, that you've done a tremendous amount of work and you've made money for your clients, which I think is great. I think winning a championship it's a very surreal feeling because there's a whole city or state that is actually behind you. You know, we had 70,000 people at the finals, and we had them all outside. We had 17,000 in the stands, and then literally like 60,000 people outside. And when we won, like just the joy that you had brought to the city was phenomenal.
Our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action. 12 p.m. on the East Coast, 9 a.m. in the West, only on Bloomberg Television, your global business authority.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition with Danny Berger and Kriti Gupta.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. Our top stories today. An eerie calm falls on Russia after a short-lived mutiny poses the greatest threat to Vladimir Putin's power. Investors assess the risks and the potential for further turmoil. China expresses support for Russian efforts to maintain national stability as the nation's diplomats meet. The yuan weakens as weak consumer spending data adds to the economic gloom. And more bank job cuts. Goldman is dismissing managing directors amid a deal slump, while JP Morgan lets go of investment bankers in North America. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom McKenzie in London, stepping in for Danny Berger. Kriti Gupta, of course, in New York. Kriti, what a weekend. Historic in terms of the geopolitics and the ruptures in Russia. But arguably the focus of markets now is on recession risks, is on the reaction function from the central banks, and also slightly weaker, again, data out of China.
It absolutely is, but I have to say they're almost connected. The geopolitics we saw over the weekend with, of course, the mood that you were seeing in terms of the inflation, the recessionary talk. The idea here simply being that what could weakness in Russia have in a read-through in a time when inflation is still a really big problem, specifically in the commodity complex. Tom, that's going to be a theme we explore throughout the next hour. But to your point, it really is the economic data that's starting to swing the mood here. We're looking at futures down about 0.2%. Again, the theme of recession certainly driving that trade. I'm going to kind of work from the bottom up for our radio audience. Stick with me here. That weak consumer spending data out of China, Tom, that you mentioned at the top of the show, sending the Shanghai Composite down 1.5%, the key underperformer in the Asia Pacific Index, but also dragging down the rest of those Asian benchmarks. What's important is what happens in the FX space as well, because you are again seeing record weakness in the offshore yuan. Even with that weak consumer data, you did see weakness in the offshore in the yuan, the offshore yuan. You saw the PBOCs try to step in, try to stem that decline, and still further weakness ensued. 723 on that currency pair. But again, what is the read-through into the European and the American markets? Well, I can tell you, Tom, in the American markets, not a great one. You are seeing bonds catch a little bit of a bid, already 5 basis points lower on the 10-year yield. We're looking at 368 there, combined with that move lower in futures, really tells you that the mood is sour indeed.
It is. The sentiment has certainly shifted. It may not be overly dramatic here in Europe, but there has been that sentiment turn because at the start, before the open, the futures were pointing to gains of around 0.2% here in Europe. That's not the way things are shaping out. Of course, about 2 hours into the trading session, there's pain being felt in the FTSE MIB over in Italy, down around 0.9%. Here in the UK, off 0.6%. Over in France, losses of 0.5%. Building on the losses, by the way, of a little over 2% across European equities last week. So the question is this profit taking or is this the start of a more sustained downturn? You had the IFO sentiment survey coming out of Germany just underscoring the weakness in Europe's largest economy. The sentiment survey there dropping to the lowest level all year. And of course, we had that surprise softness in the PMI data of last week as well. So the recession concerns front and center. We have inflation data out of Europe later this week. And of course, tuning in for ECB officials who are meeting in Portugal's Sintra as well for an important summit. Of course, Jay Powell will be there as well. So the benchmark is down currently in the session 0.5% here in Europe. We're focused on bunds because, of course, there has been a move in to the longer dated part of sovereign debt. In terms of the yield inversion in Europe, the most pronounced that we've seen in decades, the most pronounced when it comes to UK gilts, by the way, since about 2000. Euro dollar 108 after the pressure that felt last week, again, on those recession concerns. And HSBC, just pulling this story out for you, it's not going to be really linked to the news story, but it's an interesting one. It's currently down 0.8%. That's because financials as a sector are taking a big hit. But HSBC and the work from home story, they are looking to move out of their iconic tower, more than 40 stories in Canary Wharf, and potentially moving to St. Paul's by 2026. Just an iconic move there, and work from home is part of that shift for HSBC. Kriti.
You know, it's fascinating to see that those kind of moves are actually having an impact on the stock, Tom. It's going to be interesting to see how that sustains in the weeks and month ahead. But let's go back to the main story over the weekend, the geopolitics front and center. The impact of the Wagner mercenary group's mutiny and subsequent backing down is being assessed around the world. For more analysis, let's bring in Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo in Brussels. Maria, an extraordinary weekend, a historic one, if I can say that. Is the crisis over for Vladimir Putin? Is everything back to normal for him?
Look, it's very difficult to gauge because the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin himself, they've gone radio silent on this topic. Remember the last time we saw Vladimir Putin, it was on the Saturday morning where he said the country was witnessing and experiencing essentially treason, and he talked about fatal consequences. Now, what we know is that Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, decided to pull back. He appears to be alive and on his way to Belarus. Lukashenko, the head of Belarus, says he brokered this deal between Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin, but the details of it continue to be very murky. What is, however, very much working and kicking this morning is the Kremlin PR machine. Just this morning, we had footage from Sergei Shoigu, that is the defense minister of Russia, on a helicopter. He appeared to be inspecting Russian troops in the war in Ukraine. Of course, a lot of this signaling that it is back to normal, but again, there's no information on when the tape was recorded, and we know that a lot of the issues between Prigozhin, Wagner, and Shoigu and the MOD have been a source of tension, for months. Is it over for Vladimir Putin? Well, the top European diplomat this morning suggesting he has created a monster. That monster has come back to haunt him, and no matter what happens now, his image as a man that controls everything has been rattled already.
Maria, of course, a lot of questions about Prigozhin, a lot of questions about the deal and what this means. And of course, it was negotiated by Belarus. He is apparently going to be heading there in terms of exile. But you've been speaking to a really important person in terms of the connections around the politics of Belarus and their views. Just underscore, or at least explain for us what's being said by the opposition leaders there.
Yes, and just to recap, on the Saturday, Alexander Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, although again, we should note and stress the international community has pointed out many times they believe he rigged the 2020 election. He has a relationship with Vladimir Putin that goes back years, decades. This is at times a very transactional relationship. He announced that he had mediated between the two men and cut a deal that now sees Prigozhin heading to Belarus. I did speak with the head of the opposition, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she told me Lukashenko's not a hero, he's not a mediator, and if you think he's doing this for the good of his heart, you're probably wrong. Let's take a look.
We face a threat to our independence. is because of nuclear weapon and presence of Russian forces in Belarus, and now possible Prigozhin's arrival to our country. Because as far as I understand, Prigozhin will likely not come alone, but he will come with his mercenaries. And for them, neither Belarus nor Ukraine should exist. So Prigozhin might be involved in military training, trade of arms, for example. It's not excluded that Prigozhin could be involved in another attack on Ukraine from Belarus territory. Who knows?
And that was Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. Remember, she challenged Lukashenko in the 2020 election. She had to go into exile. Her husband is imprisoned to this date as we speak. And again, she pointed out this move from Prigozhin now adds another threat to the independence and the sovereignty of her country, Belarus.
Maria Tadeo in Brussels, all over that story from every angle, I might ask. The European side, the Russian side, of course, the Belarus side as well. We thank you as always. And sticking with the fallout there, the market fallout, oil is advancing as investors weigh the potential for more turmoil in Russia after their dramatic but short-lived rebellion in the major OPEC Plus producer over the weekend. In the meantime, Saudi Aramco CEO Amin Nasser says despite the recession risks in several OECD countries, the economies of developing countries, especially China and India, are driving a healthy oil demand growth of more than 2 million barrels per day this year. This is high by historical standards, he says. Joining us now to discuss the impact on the commodities complex is Bloomberg's Will Kennedy. Will, to see the fallout in the oil prices at a time when we're also getting weak consumer data, how do you square the, I want to say, 2-3 major factors this morning in the oil market?
Well, clearly, what happened in Russia over the weekend is of huge importance to the oil market. Russia produces more than 10 million barrels a day, 1 in every 10 barrels globally, and it exports more than 80% of that. So it's absolutely crucial, and I think traders will be very alive to the possible threats posed by increasing turmoil inside Russia. But it's worth saying that there has been no impact on oil production, and one of the most salient features of the oil market since the war in Ukraine started is how Russia has been able to maintain production and indeed get that production to global markets. After a blip last summer, exports are riding high. They've rejigged the direction of those exports towards Asia, principally China and India, but it's adding to the overall supply balance, which, despite the demand factors that Amin Nasser mentions, the world has ample supply from Russia and elsewhere.
Will, what about when it comes to soft commodities? There's still this kind of visceral sensitivity to higher food prices. We saw wheat popping. We were speaking to Saxo Bank, Ole Hansen, over there, the strategist around commodities. He says, actually, you should be focused on wheat in terms of the reaction function to risks in Russia.
I mean, Russia, like oil, remains absolutely crucial to the global food system, as you say. It's an enormously important wheat exporter, and a lot of those exports come through the Black Sea, come through areas like Rostov, where we saw a lot of the action over the weekend. So indeed, if there is more political turmoil in Russia, then you could have an impact on wheat exports. And then in the background, you have this continuing debate over the agreement to allow exports of wheat from Ukraine, which is always bubbling away in the background, whether Russia will continue to honor that agreement or walk back on it. So there are clear risks there. But I think it's worth saying again that the market reaction this morning remains fairly muted, which I think reflects that although there are heightened risks, heightened political possibilities in the future, right now those key flows of commodities from Russia are continuing.
Okay, Will Kennedy on that relatively muted response from the commodity markets as production and exports continue around oil and, of course, soft commodities as well, as we weigh up those potential future risks. Now, more job cuts, switching focus to the banking sector. 4 big banks. Goldman Sachs has started cutting managing directors across the globe. JP Morgan, meanwhile, cutting about 40 investment bankers in North America. Joining us now is Bloomberg finance reporter Tom Metcalf. Tom, what do we make of these cuts? This is a steady kind of drip of cutting to the bone for some of these banks. Is there more to come?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is one of sort of a series of cuts we've been reporting on. You know, at Goldman, 125 managing directors across the world. Some of them will be in investment banking. And yeah, look, my takeaway is this is not sort of the end or anything like that. I suspect there'll be plenty more of these stories going forward, just because that deal-making business, there really is not any kind of deal flow in there. So, you know, this is how the banks are going to respond. They're going to be looking to cut costs, and it's definitely a big downturn for this part of the investment banking world.
Yeah, the cuts certainly accelerating around the world. Tom, I want to stick with the banking story here because in your illustrious career at Bloomberg, you also spent some time in San Francisco. I want to talk to you about the developments around the remnants of Silicon Valley Bank. What has stood out to you? What's the surprise here?
Yeah, absolutely love this story about, who are the people who benefited from the SVB's rescue. And yes, of course, while plenty of smaller tech firms did, the thing that jumped out from our story was, it was Sequoia. That is absolutely top-tier venture capital firm. They had something like $1 billion on deposit at SVB. And, for me, that's the really interesting thing is when you have these kind of mass rescues, it turns out that, it's people who maybe didn't really need that who get it. So you had Sequoia, you also had a Beijing-based tech firm as well with something like 900 million on deposit. Again, that all got sort of guaranteed by the US government.
Wow, $1 billion in deposit from Sequoia and SVB. Tom Metcalf, thank you very much indeed, running us through and rounding up the top banking news for us. Now, coming up, Callum Pickering, senior economist at Berenberg, joins us. We'll be talking about the Russia geopolitics, the impact on the global economy, but also, of course, weaker Europe and inflation data coming up. And US stocks are now at a real juncture. That is the view of Stifel's Richard Kneller. More on that still ahead. This is Bloomberg.
What's the best investment advice you've ever been given by anybody?
The compound interest, the compounding of returns is an incredible miracle of business, finance, and human existence. Everything you learn is additive every day, and if you keep at it and don't quit, it's an incredible miracle. And it's not just interest. It was always said about compound interest returns, compound business returns, compound human returns. They're all very additive because you learn every day. And if you keep at it, it's very, very helpful.
In your observation of investors, what do you think is the biggest mistake that average investors make?
Selling at the wrong time.
And they sell when the prices go down?
Yes. Or yes. Not keeping, look, people have conviction or they invest for if they invest for the right reasons, just keep at it.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kriti Gupta in New York with Tom McKenzie in London. Global markets staying relatively muted as investors assess a weekend of geopolitical turmoil. Joining us now, Callum Pickering, senior economist over at Berenberg. Callum, you picked a perfect day to join us because there's so many different cross currents coming from various economies. Let's start with the Russia news, though. As we see the readout in the commodity space at a time when inflation is still top of mind, how big of a deal is this when you're kind of factoring it into your economic models?
It's not easy to see actually at the moment what the consequences are. I think if at the weekend on Saturday certainly looked like we had something very significant happening, it didn't happen. So markets now need to contemplate what the future holds. I mean, the issue is around Putin. How secure is he? Does that affect the course of the war? Does the uncertainty on the Russian side affect the way Ukraine can conduct its counteroffensive? But there's this phrase that you often hear, the fog of war. I think that's as high as it's ever been, and markets will have a very hard time gaming the various scenarios. I don't really think that there's anything material in the news that markets can take risk on this moment, at this time.
Callum, is that a function simply of the sanctions that have been placed on the Russian economy? Is it this idea that the read-through that perhaps markets were watching a year or so ago just don't apply anymore because of those steps taken?
Yes, there's an element of that. And also, I would just keep in mind, most of the advanced world now is basically uncoupled from the Russian economy. The adjustment in the energy sectors and the food sectors is now almost completely made. We still have some legacy effects on prices. Most of the economic issues that the Western world has to deal with are now homegrown, namely the inflation problem, which is, of course, is an echo of the war. It's a consequence, but it's not currently related. Near term, actually, war is never good. There's uncertainty around certainly some of the very significant tail risks. How does a less strong than expected Putin actually react to this? But the most important thing is we're actually learning to sort of live with the risk of war. Economies have, by and large, functioned better than expected. The inflation seems to be a little bit worse. So again, the news at the weekend is potentially material for the course of the war, but it's not easy to see what the economic and market read-through should be at this stage.
And Europe, of course, is de-linked largely from Russian oil and gas. And there was an expectation that Germany would be very badly hit towards the end of last year. It got through the winter. Now the data is looking pretty unfavourable. We know it was a recession in the first quarter. The IFO sentiment survey out today, again, the lowest level that we've seen year to date. Is it base case now for you and the team at Berenberg that you're going to see a recession in Europe? And how deep is that recession likely to be?
No recession in Europe. Of course, there's significant downside risks, stagnation for a few more quarters at still high rates of inflation, but still no recession. In the US, there's probably likely to be a Fed-engineered mini-recession. We need to just split the two issues. Again, I think it's useful, as your colleague just mentioned, let's go back a year ago. The expectation was two phases of pain. Heading into last winter, you get the pain from the energy shock, huge terms of trade shock. The second phase of pain is monetary policy. Those long and variable lags, when do they start to kick in? The first phase, Europe managed much better than expected. No genuine shortages, yes, a big price shock, a big terms of trade shock, but relative to initial expectations for a recession, mere stagnation turned out to be a very good outcome. Now the question is, what does the monetary policy, the lagged effect of that have on economies? Just keep in mind that the reason why economies have been better than expected is demand has been much more resilient. And so when you try and factor in a negative shock for monetary policy in a context of strong demand, it may just be that net you get stagnation for a while. And actually that's the base case. The risk here is that if inflation risks seem to persist, central banks then go too far and then you get that recession. But we seem to be tolerating higher interest rates much better than expected. I don't see any reason to justify a recession just yet.
On those potential risks of ECB, for example, going too far, markets now pricing in around 3.9%, so sub 4%. Do you see sub 4% in terms of the terminal rate from the ECB? And are the doves now going to have more grist to the mill in terms of the data that's coming through to push back on some of the hawks pushing for more and for longer?
It's complicated because there's a real trade-off here between reacting to near-term information, which is always very uncertain. Predicting monthly CPI is impossible. Just look at the trouble the Bank of England is having. And knowing what the policy will do over a 12-month period when it comes to inflation. I think from the ECB we get one, maybe two more hikes. The question is then, can central banks hold their nerve if you face near-term upside surprises when it comes to CPI? As we've seen in the UK, the Bank of England is not holding its nerve. Will the ECB, will the Fed? That's an open question. The risk here is that with the lags to monetary policy, if you react to potential near-term upside surprises and you go another 50 or even 100 basis points, then you overcorrect. And then next year or later this year, then you start to see that recession. The risk that markets should just keep in mind is central banks say that they're forward-looking, but they react far too much to incoming economic data, and they're backward-looking in their assessment too often. And so we over-eased in 2020, 2021. We probably did the right thing last year, and now the risk is that we over-tighten to the degree that central banks go way too far. Then we have to raise a recession call. But to the extent that the economy seems to be tolerating higher interest rates, if we get to 5 in the UK, 4 in the Eurozone and they hold their nerve, probably we don't see any economic risk from that.
Well, speaking of the economic risk, let's talk about the other region we haven't hit yet, which is China. This weak consumer spending data just adding to the deluge of weaker data you're getting out of China. Massive market reaction off of that overnight. What is the read-through into Europe, into the United States, when the Chinese reopening trade is still not fully at play here? Is it the same read-through, say, that we would have gotten 15 years ago?
So the first thing I would just mention for Europe, it's not so much the Chinese consumer that matters for export, it's actually investment. When China has strong investment, it sucks in a lot of capital goods from abroad, and it sucks in a lot of European capital goods. And so far, the disappointment for Europe has not so much been the Chinese consumer, but it's been China investment, which has been weak. Now, what I would just say at this stage is, if consumers in China remain weak, that will increase the probability that the Chinese authorities respond. They can do that through the monetary channel, they can do that through the fiscal channel. And so what we might see actually in the course of this is if China consumer is weak enough for a policy reaction on the fiscal side, and you get much more investment into the second half of this year and into next year, then you might see actually after a short-term negative surprise to global trade because of weak China, you then get an upside surprise once that investment starts up.
Okay, so watching that reaction to a potentially weaker and maybe sustained weaker Chinese consumer. Callum Pickering, thank you very much indeed. Hitting the Russia effect, of course, the ECB central bank impact, and what to watch when it comes to China's still under pressure economy. Thank you very much indeed, of course, of Berenberg. Now, staying with the Europe story and the politics now, Greece's Mitsotakis has scored a landslide victory in Sunday's general election. Greece's new electoral system awards as many as 50 seats to the winner, meaning he's set to get 158 members in the 300-seat chamber, and it's going to allow him to form a single-party government, and investor-friendly policies is what, of course, he's going to be hoping to implement. Kriti, given where we were with Greece, 12, 13 years ago, Greece now standing out across the European political space as a kind of bastion of political stability. You've got another 4 years of the market-friendly Mitsotakis.
I know, the irony that we're worried about Russia, China, and the rest of Europe, but Greece seems to have it together, really stands out. To me, the market reaction is what's interesting here, because if you look at the investment standpoint, they're outperforming on the equities front, on the bond front. Who would have thought 15 years ago that if you buy Greek bonds in 2023, you'd be outperforming the rest of the world?
Athens Stock Exchange up more than 36% year to date. Unemployment has halved? It's about 15% from about 36%. So they've done well on that. The next thing to watch, and it's something, of course, the government in Athens is determined to achieve, is getting the ratings agencies to improve the rating, of course, on sovereign debt. Currently junk level, and it's been in that rating for about 13 years. The ratings agencies are expected to reassess in the second half of this year. And if it moves out of junk rated territory, well, that is going to be another feather in the cap for Mitsotakis.
Yeah, well, one of the concerns of that, though, is just how sustainable this growth is, because at the end of the day, a good chunk of that Greek growth is coming from tourism from the United States, from Europe as well. But in a kind of downturn or in a recession that we've been expecting for 2 years or so now, how long does that growth really sustain? I think there are going to be geopolitical consequences to that as well, given that Mitsotakis' main pillars and platforms that he kind of won on was that economic growth.
They have a capital account deficit that they need to deal with. They have a majority, but he's still got these right-wing parties that are going to be in Parliament, potentially nipping at his heels and causing pressure, particularly on questions, controversial questions like immigration as well. So politically, the pressure is still going to be there for Mitsotakis, even as he has a majority. But as you say, it's significant, of course, in terms of the makeup and the fabric of European politics, and we'll see how he puts his cabinet together as well in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that crucial piece that you just mentioned, which is the immigration policy as well. Note that last week there was, of course, that tragic capsizing of the boat off the Mediterranean coast. There were concerns that would weigh on his platform as well, Tom. Looks like it didn't enough in light of the economic success.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, coming up, markets assessing a weekend, of course, of geopolitical turmoil. If you put Greece to one side, we're going to have more on that. The focus, of course, on Russia. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Venture capital. It's been volatile. From bank crisis anxiety to AI exuberance, Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow chat with the biggest names about the latest tech trends.
Is AI going to dominate the earnings narrative for this sector this week?
I think we're seeing opportunity and potential platform shift that we haven't seen in a long time.
If you're a company today and you're not embracing the changes that are taking place with AI, you're going to be behind.
How do you prove to the investor base that you haven't just tacked on AI to make yourself sexy?
It's very hard to differentiate if you're not experienced with AI.
The startup stories.
We think this is a watershed moment for technology.
Certain categories are more exciting than others. Right now, obviously, generative AI is a category that is very exciting to startup founders, customers, and venture capitalists as well.
So what we are seeing is a new area of opportunities for new founders to come and change the industries that matter.
And the real talk on realistic valuations.
Some of the best opportunities are sitting right in front of us.
How do you discern which ones are good on the marketplace right now?
I think founders have woken up to the reality that taking on more money at higher terms doesn't necessarily play to their benefit in the long run.
How do you actually invest?
Follow the VC money on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech right in the middle of the trading action. 12 p.m. on the East Coast, 9 a.m. in the West, only on Bloomberg Television. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Here's what you need to know. An eerie calm falls on Russia after a short-lived mutiny poses the greatest threat to Vladimir Putin's power. Investors assess the risks and the potential for further turmoil. China expresses support for Russian efforts to maintain national stability as the nation's diplomats meet. The yuan weakens as weak consumer spending data adds to the economic gloom. And more bank job cuts. Goldman is dismissing managing directors amid a deal slump, while JP Morgan lets go of investment bankers in North America. I'm Kriti Gupta in New York with Tom McKenzie in London. Tom, a lot to digest. Inflation, recession, still on top of mind. But I got to say, I think geopolitics takes the cake today.
Well, geopolitics is certainly driving the interest, isn't it? Certainly on the terminal, the determination, of course, to find out what is going on, what that deal means between Putin and the head of the Wagner Group, of course, following that mutiny, or at least attempted mutiny over the weekend. When it comes to the markets, though, as you touched on, as you nodded to, arguably it's more about the data, it's more about recession risks, and it's more about the determination of these central banks to go higher and longer on interest rates. As we look ahead to Sintra and that symposium where we're going to hear from Jay Powell, we're going to hear from Madame Lagarde, we're going to hear from Andrew Bailey of the BOE. European equities are down 0.4%. So building on the losses that we saw last week, plus 2% was the downside for European stocks last week. The euro, by the way, which also took a hit on the back of softer data out of Europe, particularly the PMIs, down 108, currently 108 after the hit of last week. The IFO sentiment survey out of Germany, the business sentiment survey dropping to the lowest level year to date, really underscoring the continued fragility around the German economy, struggling to move on from that recession that we know it notched in the first quarter. Money moving into the long end then around German bonds of the 10-year. You've got yields down 5 basis points, 230 as German long end debt remains bid. HSBC, just one corporate to bring to your attention. They are potentially looking to move out of their iconic Canary Wharf headquarters in the City of London, currently down 0.5%, moving as work from home is readjusting how much space they think they need. Kriti, what is the setup looking like for US then?
Well, I have to say, I think the micro story, the churn that you're seeing in the banking sector, not having as much of a read-through stateside right now, is pretty much mostly macro. And I have to say, perhaps Asia-driven as well. We mentioned that weak consumer spending data out of China specifically. Well, it's sent the Chinese Shanghai Composite Index down 1.5%, taking the entire Asian Pacific benchmark lower as well. But then you also saw some record weakness in the offshore yuan. Again, the PBOC trying to step in, stemming that decline. It didn't quite work. So we're really seeing dollar yuan at about about 723 when you're looking at the offshore trading there. The read-through is interesting because, again, Tom, you mentioned it, the recession concerns, the growth concerns, that seems to be weighing on futures, which, by the way, overnight opened positive, perhaps in light of the Russia news. Futures down about 0.2, we'll call 1 to 0.2%. The 10-year yield is what's interesting, though, because it is 5:30 a.m. in New York, and already you are seeing about a 4 to 5 basis point move lower, perhaps following the action you are seeing in those boons, as you just pointed out. 369, Tom, on that 10-year yield.
Okay, let's get back to that geopolitical story then. The ruptures, of course, in Russia. Vladimir Putin faced what was the biggest challenge to his 2-decade rule, with, of course, that short-lived mutiny. Wagner mercenary group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin halted his fighters' advance toward Moscow as part of a deal brokered by Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko to end the 24-hour revolt. Joining us for more is Bloomberg's Mark Champion, who is in Kyiv. Mark, just get up to speed on where things stand and what we know, if anything, about this deal and whether or not it's likely to hold.
Right. So essentially, we know very little about the content of the deal. We do know that Prigozhin stood down. He had several thousand troops on their way to Moscow. He stopped. They dispersed, and we don't know where he is now. He has gone incommunicado. According to his press people, they say that he'll get back online as soon as he's in a normal communications position. So we don't know where he is. As to the deal, we know that there's some element where the Wagner troops will be offered the possibility in amnesty and a possibility of signing contracts with the regular army. But beyond that, we don't know much. Prigozhin had several demands. One of them included the resignation of Defense Minister Shoigu, and Shoigu was shown on TV this morning visiting troops in Ukraine. So we really don't know what happened there. We don't know actually if we are at the beginning or the end of this particular cycle. So we could see some more surprises. Yeah. We just don't know.
Mark, you're on the ground, of course, for us in Kyiv. You've been there a number of weeks. What is your sense of in terms of how the initiative is unfolding for the Ukrainian armed forces as they pursue this offensive? Does it play to their advantage? How is it all affecting operations on the ground?
Well, they absolutely hope that it will. Their calculation is that anything that's bad for Putin, anything that disturbs the regime, makes them focus on internal issues, has got to be good for Ukraine, has got to be eventually play some sort of role on the battlefield. Whether that's the case, we'll have to wait and see. So far, the sort of daily news of what's going on doesn't show any direct link to events in Russia. Every day there are movements by either side. The Ukrainians, as you say, are in counteroffensive in the south. They're pursuing that, but there's no sudden move that looks very different from what had been happening in previous days.
Mark, so that is the kind of physical movements of the key players there. Talk to us a little bit about the disinformation campaign. I think something that really stood out to me in terms of his kind of resume is that in 2016, with the meddling of the U.S. elections, he was one of the people to implement that disinformation campaign. What does disinformation look like now relative to this issue?
Well, so the Kremlin is trying to portray business as usual, but it's really been punctured, and he moved way off script by attempting this, not a coup. I mean, as far as we know, he said it wasn't a coup attempt. As far as we know, it wasn't. What he wanted really was that he runs this big mercenary group, Wagner. They make a lot of money. They have a lot of power in Africa, but they've also been very involved in Ukraine. And the threat to him was that Wagner was going to be dismantled and he would lose his money, his base, his everything. So he made this move, exactly what he wanted. We can't be sure. Publicly, he said he wanted the resignation of these various officials that he's been feuding with for the past months. So beyond that, we don't know a great deal about what was going on in private conversations.
Mark Champion reporting live on the ground for us in Kyiv. We thank you as always and stay safe. We look forward to what you have to report. For more analysis, let's bring in Ekaterina Shulman. She is a political scientist specializing in the legislative process in modern Russia. Pleasure to have you on the show. Walk us through this dynamic that Mark just laid out here. The idea that he claims this wasn't a coup attempt against Vladimir Putin himself, but rather against the defense minister. Shed a little light on the dynamic between Prigozhin and the defense minister, Shoigu.
It did look more like a business deal operated through military means than any political move, frankly. The popular description of Russia as a gas station posing as a country is, of course, unfair, but that we do have a chain of shady business operations masquerading as political leadership may be closer to the truth. It is true that Prigozhin's rhetoric was mostly aimed against defense minister and the head of general headquarters, Gerasimov. But recently, some of the things he said seemed to point directly to the president, and his public description of this March for Justice, which was the name he gave to his personal private offensive, was that we should stop living under corruption, dysfunctionality, etc. And this was a description of political system in general rather than at something dysfunctional at the defense ministry. So he was trying to create some sort of public political position for himself. He even before that attempted coup or a mutiny, to be more exact, he made a tour across Russian regions, meeting people, making speeches, and looking all in all like a potential presidential campaign. But that, again, was based on his dissatisfaction with the way he was treated. If we listen to what he says, he said, we had a lucrative business in Africa, we, Wagner, the private military company, but then motherland was in danger, they asked us to help, we helped, but they're not treating us fairly, and now they want to dismantle Wagner. So either pay us or let us go back to Africa to make money. Again, it was all very much in the open. So there was the business part and there was a political part. Judging by the events of this weekend, the business part kind of won over the political.
I love that you talked about it as a kind of through the business lens, of course, given that we're a financial network. Talk to us about Prigozhin's future here specifically. You talked about the potential unwinding of the Wagner network. For Prigozhin, is it really likely that he remains kind of this millionaire in Minsk? What does his future look like?
I don't think we should concern ourselves with his personal future. What I would be looking at is the fate of the institution, Wagner, the private military company, which is, by the way, not the only private military company in Russia, but by far the most public one. So what was happening during these last weeks can be generally described as an attempt on the part of Ministry of Defense to get back all the armed forces under its wing. So the regulars were trying to get rid of the irregulars by either absorbing them or dealing with them otherwise. You should remember how the Deputy Minister of Defense declared that by July the 1st, all the so-called volunteers, which are actually mercenaries, should sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense and so become regular contracted soldiers under the defense ministry. And Prigozhin refused very publicly to do this, even after the president seconded this order by saying that it is really for the good of the soldiers so that they can have social guarantees from the state, etc. So they should sign the contract. But Prigozhin said, no, we're not going to do that, using in his very descriptive language the phrase, we will not go down by the path of dishonor, which is colorful. So that was the nucleus of the conflict. Now what we want to see is what happens to Wagner. Are they being dismantled? Will some people be prosecuted for whatever, for mutiny or for other crimes connected with the things they usually do? Will they be made to sign contracts or maybe given a choice of either signing contracts or going home scot-free? So this is interesting rather than what happens to Prigozhin personally. People of his business model rarely die a natural death.
Wow, yes. I mean, history bears that out, doesn't it? At least recent history in Russia. Ekaterina, I didn't want to shift, so focus on what happens with Wagner, and that'll give us a tell in terms of maybe the success of Putin to absorb that military group into the traditional Russian army and whether or not that indeed kind of shores up some of his political support. But on the political support or lack of it for Putin, I just want to reference one of our Bloomberg opinion columnists, Leonid Bershinsky, and this is one of the quotes that stands out from his piece. Putin has not, for the first time, but at a critical moment, shown weakness. Even though Prigozhin didn't win, his anarchical mutiny move exposed the regime's brittleness to all who might want to exploit it. The emperor is naked. How exposed is Vladimir Putin at this point, Ekaterina?
Of course, it's hard to interpret the events of this weekend in any other way as a sign of weakness or, in the language of political science, autocratic fragility, which is one of our basic concepts, but hard to explain sometimes to people, because what autocracies do is they project the image of strength, maybe ruthlessness, effectiveness, stability, whatever. But they're really quite fragile. They cannot do power transfers. They cannot do power transits the way democracies can do it. They are very much dependent on personalities, and when something happens to these personalities, systems tend to fall apart. So it's exotic to look at, but really it's quite typical. It's something out of textbook. But for the moment, the president is in his place. This is the most we can say. Yeah. What I would be expecting to see is the emergence of some group who will claim to have saved the motherland, or at least the president, from this armed mutiny. Who will be the saviors of the nation? I think we will see it if we see some personal changes. So far, the Minister of Defense has tried to step to the public front and project this business-as-usual image that you have mentioned earlier. But will there be changes in the Defense Ministry? Will there be changes in the FSB, for example? Many insiders have named the Tula region governor, Alexei Dumin, as a kind of person who somehow managed to stop the march on Moscow, because it is true that the Wagner's column stopped about 200 kilometers from Moscow, which is Tula region.
Ekaterina, yes. We're running out of time, but we appreciate your insights and what to watch in the days and weeks ahead when it comes to the politics of Russia and the fate of Putin. That is Russian political scientist Ekaterina Cholman, an associate fellow at Chatham House. Thank you. Coming up, we're going to speak to Richard Neller, US equities desk strategist at Stifel, how to position in this environment. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
London will stay a financial center. It will stay our EMEA hub. We'll just have a rebalancing onto the continent. And actually, the numbers of who has moved across aren't that big. So it's sort of in the 200 level. And if you think about 15,000 people, that's sort of not that material. And so I do think both will basically continue to grow and continue to be very relevant. What will change, though, and the big thing that's changing, is actually the risk-taking is what's going to move. And so we've historically had risk-taking in the UK. That risk-taking and the assets that go with it, not the people alone, but the assets that go with it, that's the next phase of what we're now moving into. And that will be a material change.
yours for news and analysis covering the biggest challenges facing the UK government, economy, financial services and markets.
Tax cuts should not be the priority. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
In this post-Brexit world, how do you see actually servicing your clients?
It was disruptive, and it's going to have implications to how capital raising works.
Now we're having the perfect storm in the UK.
Watch Francine Lacqua Thursdays at 9:30 a.m. only on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
There's a lot to digest over the weekend, and perhaps a very real read-through when it comes to the economy and, of course, the U.S. stock market as well. Let's break it all down. Richard Neller from the U.S. Equities Desk strategist over at Stifel joins us bright and early this morning. A pleasure to have you on the show, Richard. Look, let's tie the geopolitics and the economics together. I'm a history buff, though, so bear with me. One of my favorite kind of reference points to look at, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine, was back in the 60s when you had a massive 9-month bear market, 1962, and the trigger that turned it around in the U.S. stock market was the ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What kind of positivity out of the war in Ukraine and the potential weakness in Russia, could that be a sustainable tailwind for the U.S. equity market?
Good morning. Good to see you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, it's beyond fascinating what's happening in Russia. And, you know, I'm not a geopolitical strategist or political scientist. I was listening to your prior guest. I think, as I was thinking about it over the weekend, and I was actually surprised that the Asian markets overnight didn't react more. I think you probably have to break it down, at least the way I'm thinking about this. And of course, this is all fluid, but they're sort of, you know, short, medium, and longer term. I think in the short to medium term, if there is the perception, which seems to be from the West, that Putin is weakened by this, that the regime is ever at risk, then of course the logical deduction is that that's beneficial to the Ukrainians as there's internal strife within Russia. I would think the longer term ramifications are that should this be a catalyst or move towards Putin's regime toppling or imploding and Ukraine winning, then, you know, what is the vacuum that follows it? And you mentioned, you know, you're a history buff. I'm also a popcorn history buff as well. And we know that after key historic events, vacuums fill. And the issue is therefore what follows that. Now that's the unknown at this point. As it pertains to US equity markets or global equity markets, I think there's that short, medium, and term, longer term view. And
Richard, do you want to be starting to position? Do you start to put in some positions around an enfeebled Vladimir Putin, around the potential prospect of a Ukrainian victory and the upside that may come through that across equities, or is it too soon?
I think it's still too soon. This is all very fluid. But nevertheless, if it seems over the coming days and weeks that Russia's on the back foot, that the Ukrainian push, the counteroffensive starts to get momentum, I would think markets would like that across the board. And the marginal dollar will probably go into more risky assets relative to defensive assets. That would be my instinct at this point, but I'll defer more to, you know, political scientists. But as I said, it's early days and it's fluid, but it's beyond fascinating.
Richard, just very quickly on Mike Wilson over at Morgan Stanley's call that the headwinds are just too great for these US equity markets. Do you want to be taking profit at this point?
I think the index upside is limited here. The work that we've done, we actually recently raised our S&P target, actually in early May, to 4,400. Our positioning, the chief US equity strategist who I work with here at Stifel, Barry Bannister, we've been far more tactical and really the other side of the trade since last autumn. At 43.50 or wherever we are at the moment, roughly, I think there's limited index upside. The person that you referenced at Morgan Stanley, I know one of his big calls is about the S&P earnings falling well below 200. I mean, we're at 204 and we're looking for flat year on year. Consensus has been moving down. So I think the index upside is limited here. The work that I do is where I'm thinking about into the second half and 24, where one should be relatively more positioned in a defensive sense.
Okay, Richard Neller, really appreciate your insights on the geopolitics and US equities in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you from Stifel, of course. Coming up, the Activision Microsoft FTC hearing continues this week. We're going to have more on that next. This is Bloomberg.
Steve's ability on the course may not be etched into any record books, but following him around, it's clear that it's not for lack of trying.
Jeez.
We were constantly hustling behind him as he caught up with executives in the portfolio companies and reminisced with former and current players.
He's a day trader. He taught himself, self-made day trader. Yeah. And so he's on the bus after a game in New England, and he's day trading on the bus, and Bill Belichick sees him and cuts him on the spot.
In many ways, it's a convention, right, of the people that I don't see maybe once a year. And so it's kind of all come together. My firm, our charity, fundraising efforts, and then the friends that are around. My dad and my brother, it all happens right there as a confluence of all these parts of my life that have found its common center.
People ask me all the time, what is the key to being a really good investor? And I tell them it's to surround yourself with and work with the best investors you can find. On Bloomberg Wealth, I'm going to take you to meet the greatest investors in the world, the people that I would like to have managing my money.
Climate is one thing that connects everybody across the globe. And if we don't do something about it, it brings down the value of all companies.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kriti Gupta in New York with Tom McKenzie in London. Look, Tom, $70 billion at stake here, at least a deal between Microsoft and Activision. We saw some pushback from the UK. And now we're getting pushback in the U.S. as well. I want to walk you through the story, Tom, because it is fascinating to me. We are in the middle of an FTC kind of court injunction. They requested the federal courts to pull and delay the U.S. Kind of Activision approval process for Microsoft to get onto the $70 billion deal. You are seeing a little bit of pushback here on simply the idea that maybe this deal might not go through. The leader of the kind of legal team of the Microsoft side saying if there is some sort of delay, it's going to take 3 years to kind of navigate, and therefore the deal just might not be worth it. I can kind of quickly bring about the other side of this equation very quickly. We did get some comments from the PlayStation CEO owned by Sony pushing back against the exclusivity of the Xbox deal. He's saying, well, maybe exclusivity isn't an issue here, and that's something that's being played out in court at the moment.
It was a fascinating image painted by the reporting of the head of videos at Microsoft putting his hand up, holding his hand up in court and saying, I pledge that we will not be blocking Call of Duty and the sales of Call of Duty to Sony and others. It is a story worth watching. That's it for Early Edition. Of course, Surveillance is up next with Ian Bremner and many other top guests. This is Bloomberg.
politics
We're not going to be relying upon countries whose values we don't share.
to the world of business.
It's all about corporate power at the end.
Balance of Power, live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters.
We couldn't be more excited what's in store for you.
How long will it take? How many years?
Why don't we take this one day at a time?
Good luck. Everybody has a perspective.
Every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Join hosts Anne-Marie Hordern.
It's the one area, really, of bipartisanship.
I think we're getting more of it.
That's optimistic.
And Joe Matthew.
The debt ceiling is looming. How close are we going to get to the line before you start to worry?
Alongside Kaylee
The
Lyons.
door was open for regulators to do more, and that puts the Fed between a rock and a hard place.
As they deliver news.
This is such an important economic issue.
He's no longer trying to run away from
That really blew some minds.
Insight.
We can both invest in law enforcement and also make sure that communities feel safe in their own skin.
And analysis.
I think your audience will get this more than most. This is not the Republican Party that you know.
It allows him to do what he did so successfully in 2020, which is run against crazy.
From and about politics' biggest power players.
This was the zombie case, and it's now more than well alive.
That's for sure. With two more potentially to come.
I'm willing to have this battle.
It is vitally important.
This is the intersection of Washington and Wall Street.
Bringing people directly to the decision makers
Right.
that impact your investments and your life.
Balance of Power, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg, your global business authority. In a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
We indeed have a rally.
We're talking a lot of dividends. We're talking income.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg.
Both consumers and companies have been more resilient than really the consensus expected.
That wall of money is out there spending, and particularly on services.
We think that these recession headwinds are going to catch up with us.
The bigger risk is that the Fed loses its resolve in the face of this weakness and allows inflation to become entrenched.
We're probably at one of those precipices right now where we're peaking in optimism.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene from New York on a Monday. Radio and television, the markets, yes, we will look at equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. But Lisa, after an extraordinary weekend, it is Bloomberg International Relations for the next 3 hours.
Everyone wants to understand what actually happened over the weekend with respect to this march on Moscow by the Wagner Group, by Prigozhin, who had been an ally of Vladimir Putin, and then what this means longer term in terms of Vladimir Putin's reign and just the war in Ukraine in general.
Oh, it's going to be interesting to see. We're going to go to Maria Tadeo here in a moment to get an update on this. She will appear in the 7 o'clock with Anne-Marie Hordern, and Lisa will tell you about some of our wonderful guests coming up to give you perspective. We're going to focus on the news and the reporting as we aggregate all the news sources here, Bloomberg and all the rest, reporting on the facts as we see them of this huge event. Lisa, I was stunned at the rumors and the back and forth and the I was looking for you out on Twitter being a Russian expert there at midnight.
Well, that's true. Everyone gets to be a Russian expert overnight. Here's the issue right now. Nobody really knows, right? What don't we understand right now? We don't understand what the motivation was in the March on Moscow. What was behind it? Was it just Prigozhin and the Wagner upset and anger about the lack of provisions? Was this something else funded from somewhere else? We do not understand. We don't know the longer-term ramifications for Vladimir Putin, for his relationship at the top of the nation, but also with Xi Jinping over in China. These are all the questions percolating, but I think that the takeaway here is it heightens uncertainty. Fascinating that we come into a market little changed at a time when people don't understand which side of the tail risks to really hang on to.
And what Bloomberg News has done all through the weekend is to try to bring you legit experts on this moment. Please stay with us through the morning on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. Lisa's going to give you the surveillance names, including Dr. Bremer is scheduled to join us here at some point. And then later on, this is the interview I will pay the closest attention to. The tank general from the United States Army, Ben Hodges, will join us in the 10 o'clock hour. I believe that's with Alex Steele. And Alina Polikova was one of the few people out on Twitter with common sense in the heat of this. I can't remember. I think it was Saturday night. I can't remember, but I'm thrilled to have Dr. Polakeva with us as well. What's your observation on this, Lisa?
Well, I think that really what I find interesting is the markets are inconclusive about what the implications are. They're just as confused as everybody else. And the stasis that you're seeing, yes, you are seeing a bit of a lift in natural gas prices over in Europe, but other than that, it's unclear what people see as the longer-term ramifications. My larger observation is there are cracks in the armor behind Vladimir Putin because there are real questions about his leadership and who was opposing the Wagner Group in that march.
The data check quickly here. Futures at -6. I'm watching renminbi gives way here 7.24 and a stunning and weaker Chinese yuan. Yes, ruble is weaker back a certain number of months as expected. And in the economic slowdown discussion, yields lower this morning on the global economy in West Texas Intermediate 69.40. I guess you're briefing us, including Dr. Bremer's appearance.
Yeah, Dr. Bremer is going to be joining us at 8:15 a.m. Also joining us around 7:45 a.m. is Lieutenant General, former retired Lieutenant General David Deptula, also on the Academy Securities Advisory Board. Very curious to see what he has to say. 10:30 a.m., the latest on a slew of data that we get this week, U.S. Dallas Fed manufacturing activity. This comes after a slew of disappointing
That's an
reads.
ugly chart.
Exactly. And how much does this continue to point to recession, which is what people are wondering about. And 1:30 p.m., the Sintra conference, the basically Jackson Hole of Europe, kicks off. ECB President Christine Lagarde is giving opening remarks at this ECB forum on central banking around 1:30 p.m. today.
Right now, let's get to Maria Tadeo here. She has been working on this tirelessly through the weekend and really trying to correlate all of the reporting and news that's out there. Maria Tadeo is in Brussels. What is the latest, Maria?
Well, Tom, what we know is that now the Russian state media in the past hour has said that this idea that Vladimir Putin and the Russian state would not launch a probe into Prigozhin for his insurrection is not the case, that the probe has not been dropped, and that potentially continues. And that is significant because if you go back to Saturday, the idea was that Alexander Lukashenko, the head of Belarus, had mediated between Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin to avoid a bloodshed in Moscow, and there was somehow a peacemaking deal. Now, if the Russians decide to go after Prigozhin and they do indeed continue this probe, it means there is no such deal.
Do we have a sense, Maria, of what the internal discussions are about Vladimir Putin's leadership and why there wasn't more opposition to the Wagner troops as they did march on Moscow?
Well, what we did see on Saturday, well, first of all, is the Russian president who addressed the nation and said this is treason, and he mentioned 1917. Obviously, that's a crucial date in Russian history. He talked about tragic repercussions and critical consequences for this. Then, of course, after that, we saw, or the day, well, there would be no probe. But now we see this morning that the Russians are saying that probe has not been dropped. So that would signal that, again, this deal cut by the Belarusians is actually, well, thin paper, and there's no such deal. The other issue is we have not actually seen from the Russian president since Saturday, but we did see today what seemed to be the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, allegedly on a helicopter inspecting Russian troops. Now, again, we don't know when this was recorded. We don't know when this was filmed. We know that Russians release tape that was at times can be filmed months, weeks prior, but it would signal a strong message, and that is the defense minister of Russia continues to be Shoigu and has the backing of the Kremlin. Remember, a lot of the tensions over the past few months between Prigozhin and the Russian state had to do over what he claimed to be the mismanagement of the Russian army by Shoigu. Today, miraculously, magically, he appears on tape inspecting troops.
Do we have a sense, Maria, of how much the Chinese leadership is involved right now? We know that we met over the weekend, but in terms of how they're trying to push the situation one way or another in order to keep their alliance with Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's very quiet, and in fact, we have not seen any major contact between Vladimir Putin and the Chinese leader. And Vladimir Putin was busy on Saturday on the phone with what he perceives are his international allies, and he did make a call to Turkey and spoke to Erdogan, who said, I support Vladimir Putin against what he described was a coup, but he was not on the phone with the Chinese, at least not in a way that we know openly. To me, it's interesting this morning, the top European diplomat, again, going back to this idea of Prigozhin, He says Russia and Vladimir Putin created a monster, and that monster is still alive, which by itself is surprising.
Maria, see you in the next hour. Maria Tadeo here, coalescing all of our coverage in continental Europe over what's going on in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Right now, we turn to the markets, and they are markets looking for economic slowdown. Jeffrey Yu joins us, senior market strategist, Bank of New York Mellon. How close are we to global recession, Jeff Yu?
Not super close yet, but if I look at the Eurozone IFO surveys, this notion that only a technical recession in Europe, which is not going to be prolonged, I think the ECB may need to revisit that. So tonight's speech and the speeches over the next few days and by the hawks on the ECB, I think they're going to have to be very, very careful with their language because they may now be edging into the over-tightening camp, and that's always bad for global growth.
The over-tightening camp is there, and I guess this is a demonstrable linkage between what we've witnessed over the weekend. Are the events in the international fragility of Russia enough to derail the tendencies or the oomph of central banks?
I think right now they'll just be observant and see what the wider ramifications are. Of course, if this is not the end of it, and I think many markets do not think this is going to be the end of it, of course, there will be repercussions and central banks will then react accordingly. But ultimately, it's about demand versus inflation. And again, in the Eurozone, on the continent, and Russia, of course, will play into this. We are seeing clear signs of a demand slowdown. And I think that's something that needs to be reacted to. UK is in a different place, of course. And then, of course, there's also the China situation not getting any better. So you, as a Eurozone policymaker, will need to ask yourself, where's going to be the demand? Where's going to be the risk appetite? It just doesn't seem to be there right now.
Jeff, I'm curious, as I came in today, about what kind of tail risks were heightened on both sides and which would seem as the more likely tail risk. It seems evenly balanced right now, whether you could get a quick end to the Ukrainian war, and that leads to a real rally, or whether we unleash exogenous threats, considering a leadership vacuum at the helm of one of the nuclear powers. How are you expecting this to be played out by market participants?
I think market participants, after last year, there was a tail risk which they didn't anticipate. They'll be far more attuned to that right now, looking at their geopolitical analysis, looking at what assets are reacted to the worst case scenarios of tail risk coming through. And I think the dollar will benefit accordingly on the back of that. And also on top of these developments, I think risk appetite unwinding, due to global growth concerns, that was on the way in any case. So we're seeing very good buying of dollar in our underlying flow data. This carry trade, led by commodity currencies, high yielders, and dare I say it, AI stocks and things like that. That seems to be on the cusp of unwinding. These things on the margins cannot advance much further. So we are looking at risk probably softening in the short term. You don't want tail risk to compound that.
This is fascinating. So in other words, you think that the trade over the next few months is going to be stronger dollar, weaker tech after the biggest rally in tech stocks ever for the first half of a year?
I think we really need to be very tactical about this, but stronger dollar against those high-yielding currencies, against those high-risk beta assets, which have done well over the past quarter or so. Hence, even with the Fed perhaps hiking once or twice more, we're looking at perhaps on once more at this point. That idiosyncratic nature, U.S. exceptionalism, it's still very much in play.
Jeff, I've got to go narrow here with you. Thunderstruck to walk in today, and of course we're all distracted by what's going on in Europe. And I see dollar renminbi out to a stunning 7.24. You got to tell me that it's a managed move by Beijing here. Where's their tolerance on weaker yuan?
They will tolerate a weaker yuan, absolutely, as long as it's in line with their interest rate cuts, as long as it's in line with their easing. It's not about levels, it's about the pace. They're going to start sounding like the BOJ. They don't like these disruptive moves. But let's get this straight here. We go back to real rates. If you want real rates lower, you cannot have a stronger currency. End of. And that's what they're managing right now.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it with BNY Mellon this morning. I mean, Lisa, it's hard to focus here on the data here. And we're going to give you what we see in the market. Some great guests coming up. Michael Darda, I believe, scheduled to be with us later. But I walk in, and we're all distracted by what's the news flow with Putin and the rest. And there's renminbi with, I'll accentuate it, a moonshot out to 7.24. Wow.
Yeah, they tightened, or they set a peg that was stronger than people expected, which raises questions about what they're going for and how they're going to try to play, especially after the data. Did you get the retail sales data in China? And it was highly disappointing over the holiday season.
2.6 standard deviations out, which is not a big deal for a lot of currencies, but for a managed currency like China, they're well behaved. That doesn't happen too often.
The bigger question to me is there are three themes today. It's on one hand, you've got obviously the geopolitical concerns around Russia. You have the question of the biggest rally in tech shares for the first 6 months of a year ever, going back, and whether it's fading. And then you also have this idea, what does this do to the inflationary pressures, right, around the world? The fact that we do have more hawkish central banks. And to me, as we drive toward both the Sintra conference as well as a slew of economic data, how do we put these together? You asked the right question, Tom. How do central bankers stick to their guns if they're looking at such great geopolitical uncertainty?
Yeah, I have no expertise on this, but to me, it's more than a distraction. And I like the reporting today from Bloomberg News, from the FT, from the Telegraph, who are desperately trying not to do opinion or speculation, but we're just looking at facts. As Maria mentioned, there's a video of the defense leader, Shoigu. Was it made before the coup?
Right, we don't know. We have no idea. There's a lot of, unclear information, and that's been clouding a lot of any assertions that people can make. One thing that's clear, this increases the uncertainties. The tail risks are going to be more significant on both sides.
One thing that's clear, we've got lots coming up. Mark Anderson, UBS Global Wealth Management, will join us here, and I believe Tina Fordham in the next couple minutes. She was brilliant over the weekend on Russia. Futures at -6, Dow futures -20. Maria Tadeo and Anne-Marie Horton in the next hour. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
London, in Sydney,
from Washington,
in Tokyo.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Here's what I'm watching.
You do not want to miss this story.
Is there the kind of upside?
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited, finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
The transactions.
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
And the technology.
Stop talking about the technology. Start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays.
DOJ or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges next.
Was going to keep rate World Cup.
This is a 3 as the economic picture does.
The BOK is getting ready to make.
We've seen some very serious cracks emerge. You have Prigozhin publicly questioning the very premise for this Russian aggression against Ukraine in the first place, the notion that somehow Ukraine or NATO presented a threat to Russia. You have someone challenging Putin's leadership very publicly and very openly. We see cracks emerging. Where they go, if anywhere, when they get there, very hard to say. I don't want to speculate on it, but I don't think we've seen the final act.
The Secretary of State with ABC on Sunday, saw that live. It was really quite something to hear him scrambling amid the non-news of Sunday morning. We welcome all of you. Bloomberg Surveillance, John Farrow's on assignment, Lisa Bramwitz and Tom Keene. We and the team have worked through the weekend. We have Bremer in the 8 o'clock hour.
8:15.
I think General Hodges will be with us in the 10 o'clock hour, and on to some other expert as well. Tina Fordham to join us here in a moment. Which headline this morning on Russia captures you, Lisa?
This question around whether there actually is any assurance for Prigozhin that he is safe in Belarus. This has always been a question. Why Putin allowed someone who he called a traitor to get away with amnesty in Belarus, whether he would go back on that. Early reports suggest we don't know. On the other hand, what are his plans? He has an entire team in Africa and various African nations, the Wagner troops. They have an incredible presence around the world. Is he going to go helm them, right? I mean, what's going to happen with all of these potential leadership roles around the world?
Huge uncertainty out there right now. We'll try to bring you the facts this morning. One of the facts was Twitter was different this time around. I guess it's Mr. Musk. I'll let you decide. But one of the calm and collected voices through Saturday and Sunday was Tina Fordham, founder and geopolitical strategist at Fordham Global Foresight, giving perspective, but perspective not off speculation and rumors, perspective off the news. Tina Fordham, when you look at the news flow that we have, what captures your attention this morning?
In some ways, Tom, I'm looking at what isn't happening or what hasn't happened, the counterfactual. I'm almost waiting for Russian TV to start playing Swan Lake, which they have a habit of doing when times get difficult. There is a real air of caution and pause that's prevailing, whether that's Secretary of State Blinken's comments, which were quite measured, as you just played, whether or not the tape of Defense Minister Shoigu is recent or not. We haven't seen Putin. As Lisa said, Prigozhin, is it a deal? Is it not a deal? We shouldn't assume that these are coordinated actions. And I think that's really important.
Right.
Market participants tend to look for data points, forming a trend line, and we don't have that yet.
Tina, when I give speeches on this and on the humility of being totally wrong, my great Tina Fordham moment was I was totally wrong on Boris Yeltsin. The way that Boris Yeltsin collapsed, are there allusions to that with Mr. Putin in the coming months?
Well, absolutely. And this is where I think political science is helpful. Authoritarian regimes can consolidate around an individual, as Putin has done over the past 23 years. They can shut down all forms of dissent. But that means that they tend to be brittle and to break rather than bend. This script, Prigozhin has gone off the reservation with his remarks, which have blown holes through all of the narratives that the West has been fed. That Russia was forced to invade because of NATO expansion, because of violation of human rights of Russian speakers, etc. No, Prigozhin said this is because they ran out of stuff to loot in Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk.
But Tina, that's exactly where I wanted to go. Why didn't Vladimir Putin shut him down months ago when he started to release these types of commentary out there? Do we have a sense of why Prigozhin was allowed to have a voice that very few people in Russia have been allowed to have about this war?
There are two possible explanations, and they can both coexist. One is that Putin needs him, that Prigozhin provides services which Putin still values, which would also explain why he hasn't had any polonium team just yet in exile in Belarus. And the other is, we have really overcredited Putin, as we tend to do with other kind of opaque regimes, with, controlling all the strings and playing three-dimensional chess. It is a rookie mistake, a violation of authoritarianism 101 to support competing armed militias, but Putin has always specialized in KGB-style divide and conquer. So having these competing power centers like the Defense Ministry and Wagner and their other militias as well, has suited him because then these guys fight each other. It's the bulldogs under a rug, as Churchill said, rather than posing a threat to him.
There's a real question here about China's response to a potential loss of Vladimir Putin's power. And this has been evident over the weekend meetings. What are you watching there in terms of what China would like to see and how they are interceding into any negotiations with Belarus, with Vladimir Putin, or just staying out of it?
China will not want to intervene, but for sure they are sweating. Ever since President Xi's remarks of a friendship without limits, I think that there was buyer's remorse pretty soon after that happened. Remember, that was early February, and the invasion happened thereafter. Let's look for statements coming from officials. They've been very modest so far, talking about internal domestic disturbances. But as much as Putin has caused global disruption, which is something that China doesn't like, I think whether we're talking about Washington or Beijing, there's enormous concern of who would replace him. And I had this moment of terror as Prigozhin was getting closer to the Kremlin, and I thought, what if he actually goes for it and there's a palace coup? And I won't be the only one who thought about that.
Tina, and this is your wheelhouse. I'm absolutely fascinated what the intelligentsia, that's a fancy word, Lisa. I don't really know how to pronounce it.
Intelligentsia.
Amy had to help me with that. Intelligentsia, or the elites, or the oligarchs, the fancy people in Russia and outside Russia, can they shape the events in Moscow and St. Petersburg?
I suspect that they're finding out just how little political capital they have. I mean, again, we assume that these are sort of closed systems that are controlled from the top, and they are much more chaotic than we realize. One of the things that political science talks about is negative loyalty. That means nobody piped up and said a word in defense of Putin, which you might have expected if he still was a going proposition in terms of a power source. What do kleptocrats do in a situation like this? Figure out how to keep as much of their stuff as possible. That's what will be happening now.
Tina, thank you so much for the brief. Tina Fordham, we're really providing leadership coverage over the weekend in the zeitgeist, if you will, with Fordham Global Foresight. I was thunderstruck of, this big international events like we've had other ones, including February, a year and a bit ago when the war started. But wow, how Twitter has changed. I was bedazzled by what I observed in my lousy feed this weekend. I was looking for Red Sox baseball, and it wasn't there.
There's a fascination right now over a drama that is so uncertain. And reading all of the newspapers over the weekend, regardless of Twitter, the newspapers don't have a clue either. And I think that what Tina just said there was really telling. What we don't know possibly tells us more than what we know in terms of the lack of visibility on Vladimir Putin, the lack of visibility on the two generals that helm his particular troops, the lack of understanding of what the agreement is, all of these questions around motivation, which is still unclear, and the goals. That, to me, remains the biggest, most interesting aspect over the weekend.
To aggregate this for you, our Bloomberg big take this morning centers on Mr. Putin facing historic threat to his total grip on power. The Financial Times, Prigozhin still faces charges, says Russian state media. The Telegraph of London, Russian agent threat to family made the Wagner leader call off the Moscow event. Some of the reporting done today. We will continue here with our coverage and, of course, also continue to look at these markets which signal global slowdown. Futures, -7. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
best investment advice you've ever been given by anybody?
The compound interest, the compounding of returns is an incredible miracle of business, finance, and human existence. Everything you learn is additive every day, and if you keep at it and don't quit, it's an incredible miracle. And it's not just interest. It was always said about compound interest returns, compound business returns, compound human returns. They're all very additive because you learn every day. And if you keep at it, it's very, very helpful.
In your observation of investors, what do you think is the biggest mistake that average investors make?
Selling at the wrong time.
And they sell when the prices go down?
Yes.
Or
yes. Not keeping, look, people have conviction, or they invest for if they invest for the right reasons, just keep at it.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Bloomberg Surveillance, good morning on a Monday, but a very, very different Monday. Amory Horton and Maria Tadeo will join us in the next hour. Dr. Bremer will join us in the 8 o'clock hour, on to General Hodges in the 10 o'clock hour with further discussion of all the events. We'll keep you up to date on the reporting on these events from Russia, from Belarus, and from, of course, Ukraine. Anything from Washington and London will probably parachute that in. Maria Tadeo insists we do that. Elisa, right now the market response here, futures -7. I'm going to call it a slight weight to the tape. NASDAQ with a little greater percentage move. VIX out of stick, full point, 14.50. Lisa, we haven't even mentioned this in the Russia focus this morning. Yields, I'm going to use a very fancy CFA phrase, they're nuts. The 2-10 spread out to 102 basis points shows that yield coming in on the distant paper, the 10-year yield.
What I find interesting is that the moves are not bigger this morning. And right now, we're seeing a bit of a grinding in the same direction that we saw perhaps on Friday, but we're not seeing a wholesale shift, even though the news over the weekend caused people to go into their desks and really scrutinize every bit of information. To me, people still trying to assess, do we go to our playbook that we had for a hot second, or do we have to shift it all over again?
Currency is somewhat of a stability here. Again, American oil, 69, 62, a little bit under. There is discussion of global slowdown, of course. The iconic statement of the last 100 days was at the International Monetary Fund meetings, looking out 3 years, 5 years of true lethargy in the global economy. Somebody who's lived this for decades is Carl Weinberg. He's chief economist at High Frequency Economics. And as the adult in the room, he is focused on the lofty climbs of Sintra in Portugal, one of the most beautiful towns in Europe where the elite will meet to greet here. Carl Weinberg, explain to our audience why Sintra matters to you.
Hi, good morning, Tom. Good morning, Lisa. You know, I'm looking at Sintra, and we've got an opportunity for key central bankers to explain themselves. The big show is going to be on Wednesday, when we're going to have Fed Chair Powell on the same stage as Christine Lagarde, as Andrew Bailey of the United Kingdom, and as Ueda-san from the Bank of Japan. And this is a chance for the four of them to explain together not only how their policies are working for their own countries, but how their policies are working together to bring global inflation to a halt without killing the economy. And in the background, world trade contracted in April, according to the latest data from the Dutch Central Planning Board. And every time we've seen world trade contract over the last 60, 70 years, there have been 5 episodes of world trade contraction, and every one of them has led to a slowdown or a recession in the global economy. So this is not a good sign that we're seeing out there. There's a lot of stuff on the table.
The dynamics right now, bank to bank, of traditional monetary policy, it may be something like Hicksian ISLM theory, or name 4 other major theories, including monetarist theory. Does Carl Weinberg have an operating theory right now, or is the only theory we're coming out of a pandemic?
Well, you know, I have a surprisingly positive outlook for all the countries in the world economy, despite the slowdown in trade. I'm not sure whether the slowdown in trade is an anomaly or whether it's an actual real signal. And I look at the economies involved. Let's X Japan out of this, but US, Euroland, UK. And while the UK economy and Euroland are in a tough mess right now, they're at full employment. The unemployment rate in Europe is the lowest it's been since EMU. UK unemployment is near historic lows. US unemployment is at epochal lows. So we're at full employment, and inflation is slowing. And by a year from now, inflation will be back down pretty much where the central banks want it to be, or very, very close to it. So I'm thinking about a world at full employment. I'm thinking about a world with price stability. And I'm thinking about a world with positive real interest rates. That's the missing piece. And I'm wondering where the central banks are going, but I'm trying to be very optimistic that we're just in a rough patch right now in Europe, in the UK, slowing a bit in the United States, but that by a year from now we'll be at full employment and growing again. And I just have to power my way around this declining world trade and see where we end up after it all settles down.
When was the last time, Carl, that you were this positive?
You know, probably, let's see, in the 1960s, maybe, somewhere, around the time of graduating high school. I tend to look, historically, I've tended to look at the dark side, and I've sort of viewed my role in the financial markets as being the person who thinks about what goes wrong. And a lot can go wrong, but I've just been looking at these employment reports. I look at the U.S. employment data. You know, I sit in my chair, I look at my Bloomberg, I look at the numbers, I say, we're at full employment. What's the problem? I look at the UK data, we're at full employment. I look at Europe, everyone who wants a job is finding a job. You know, that's a success story. If we have a little bit of inflation now, and maybe we'll get less inflation in a year, monetary and fiscal policy are in place to make that happen. So maybe something good can come out of this. Maybe policy can finally get us to where we want to be for a change.
I love the optimism. We do get a lot of naysayers on this program regularly, and what they would say, what can go wrong? It would be the big event in Sintra, where you have Jay Powell, Christine Lagarde, Andrew Bailey, a host of other central bankers who don't necessarily have the confidence that you do that inflation will continue to go downward in a material way. How concerned are you about them continuing with hawkish rhetoric and hawkish actions that curtail the dynamism that you're talking about?
Well, Lisa, just looking at the headline CPIs, which after all are the target of the inflation target, are the object of the inflation targets that we have out there, and just taking into account the basis effects and doing trend extrapolations, we get inflation back down to target by the first quarter of next year in all three of the economies I just mentioned, US, UK, Euroland. And that's pretty good. You know, and that doesn't involve any economics. That's just arithmetic, moving the CPI forward by the seasonal factors only. So that's like a base case that says that unless something goes wrong, we're going to get there in a year. And that may not be as fast as the central banks want to get there. And that's what they're telling us. And that's why they're continuing to hike rates. But I have a theory, a personal view, nobody's told me this, that the central bankers want to get real interest rates in the 2 to 3% range. That's their target. Having been at negative real policy rates for 15 years since the financial crisis, a key objective of this is to get positive real interest rates at a level that's slightly deflationary, slightly breaking the economy so that we don't break through full employment, but able to nonetheless support growth at full employment with